That morning's call took Nick by surprise. When he saw the name of the caller, he became alarmed. "Yes, Vincent here. Is something wrong? Has Nayli gotten worse? Do you want to make a will? What, for 2 people at once? What's the rush?" "No, I'm sorry, of course, but I think it's a little early, to say the least." There was a tense pause, after which the interlocutor made it clear to Nick that the decision was final and irrevocable. "Okay, I'll be there. Yeah, in about an hour and a half. Tell Nayli not to worry. I'll be there on time," Nick replied, giving his voice the impartiality it needed, and disconnected the call. He did not want to go to McCullough, especially on such a sad occasion, and the young notary had a good reason for that. Nick worked in the notary office for the 5th year and never regretted that he had connected his life with law. By his 35, he had everything that many of his peers could not dream of: a nice house, an expensive car, and a favorite job. What else do you need? True, there was one painful topic that Nick did not like to talk about. And that topic was family. 2 years ago, Nick divorced his wife, who chose his best friend as a lover. Since the couple had no children, the divorce was almost painless. A man, he was not greedy, and at parting did not leave his former wife in poverty. Of course, deep down he was very sorry for the aimlessly lived years. On the other hand, any experience. After all, he, as you know, teaches well, but takes dearly. Putting aside sad thoughts, Nick began to get ready for work. A visit to McCullough's house would take him at least 2 hours of valuable time, and lawyer's time was worth its weight in gold. Taking with him a leather briefcase with everything he needed, Vincent headed for the car parked outside the house. The luxury foreign car looked magnificent, especially in the shy spring sunlight. Nick was about to get into the car when someone tugged gently on his coat sleeve. He turned his head to the left and saw a boy of about 7 or 8 holding a crumpled sheet of paper in front of him. "What do you want, buddy? Money?" "I'll just get my purse," Nick fussed, putting his hand into his pocket. "No, Uncle, I don't want any money. You'd better give the note to the aunt you're going to see." "Only from hand to hand." In person, the boy asked insistently. Nick raised his eyebrows in surprise. So much for the morning meeting. What does this kid mean? Did he really know Nayli McCullough? Seeing the doubt in the notary's eyes, the boy added, "Don't you think I'm telling the truth? And I know Aunt Nayli, and my mother too. Met her in the park during a walk." "Mother? Who's your mother?" Nick asked with unconcealed irony. Catching the mockery in the man's voice, the boy sniffed resentfully. "My mom's my fortune teller. She sees everything. She has a gift. She can see into the future. And then what she sees, she writes it down on a piece of paper and gives it to the person to whom the prediction is addressed." Nick whistled in surprise and shook his head. Wow. What a busy start to the day. Fortune tellers, predictions. What on earth was going on? It wouldn't hurt if he just handed the note to the addressee, though. Let Nayli decide what to do with the information. Confident that his conclusions were correct, the notary took the crumpled sheet and tucked it into his coat pocket. "All right, I'll do it all. Keep in mind I'm taking the note without reading its contents, so hopefully there's nothing wrong with it. I'd hate to look foolish in the eyes of a client." The little boy's cheeks flared with embarrassment. "Oh, really? How can you do that? I would do anything for Aunt Nayli, and this note is very important and necessary." All right, I believe it. All right, bye. I'm sorry, I have to go." The boy nodded and, after seeing the car drive away with his eyes, went home with a sense of accomplishment. While Nick was thinking about the case of the boy's mysterious note, his McCullough clients were going about their lives. Unlike the previous days, today Nayli woke up quite early. When illness overtakes, not everyone can sleep well. The woman sighed sadly and went to the window. It was freezing at night. The quiet and cozy yard of their house was covered with fallen leaves. The end of autumn and the breath of approaching winter was felt by everyone in the city. The mood was depressed. The treatments were still not working. Her husband, Vincent, convinced her otherwise. "Honey, you have to be patient. Here is a new drug began to use, and the doctors do not give up hope. Sam says the treatment is making progress." There was a look of doubt on Nayli's face. Progress? How could he be making progress? A private doctor would say a lot of things to support a patient and keep the truth from him. But she felt it was different. But she should know the peculiarities of her own body. What's there to say? Nayli had shown signs of a formidable ailment about 2 months ago. At first it was just a malaise, nausea in the morning. Dizziness interfered with work and generally suggested pregnancy. But when Nayli bought the tests, everything immediately fell into place. There was no pregnancy at all. However, the woman herself was not surprised, because the McCulloughs were not destined to have children. Vincent, as usual, did not believe in his wife's premonitions, considering her an alarmist and easily suggestible person. It's easy for you to reason, isn't it? It's not you who's going through a pregnancy breakdown, it's me. It's just awful. It's like a piece of you is being torn away and never coming back, Nayli objected. Vincent shook his head. In his mind, any problem could be solved with money. Big or small, of course, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was desire. No children. Is that a reason to be sad? You can try IVF treatment, and if it doesn't work out, it's no big deal. Unfortunately, no matter what the couple did, the desired pregnancy never came. Deep down, Nayli realized that if it hadn't been for that fatal accident on the road, things might have been very different. If Vincent hadn't been speeding, he would have seen the lone pedestrian and slowed down in time. But that's not what happened. No, nothing irreparable happened, at least for the pedestrian. Vincent swerved the steering wheel and avoided the collision by flying out onto the sidewalk. Fortunately, there were few people around at the time and no casualties. There were casualties, though, and Nayli was the first to feel it, her lower abdomen cramping violently. Second month of pregnancy. And here's the bottom line. Emergency hospitalization, tears, hysterics. Vincent, of course, tried to justify himself by saying it was just an accident. But according to Nayli, when you can't get pregnant for a long time and finally get what you want, there can't be any accidents. This happened 2 years ago. Seems like yesterday. Of course, Nayli forgave her husband. But how could she not, when she loved him with all her heart? As she listened to Vincent's excuses this morning, she sensed that he was obviously not telling her something. But why am I being treated at home? Why don't they give me a room at Sam's clinic? What kind of treatment is it when the doctor sees the patient once a week? What about daily rounds, checkups? Vincent's face finally changed. Nayli, what's wrong with you? You don't need this hospital regimen. It's last century, for God's sake. At home, the walls heal, you know. And the fact that the doctor comes once a week is a good thing. Sam's got it under control, and he keeps a personal record of your medical history, Vincent said. Nayli looked carefully into his eyes and saw nothing in them, no fear, no sympathy, nothing at all. He looked at her as if she were a marble statue, not a living person. And Nayli sensed that her husband was obviously hiding something. But what? What was he talking about in the study with Sam for so long? Was it really that bad? Why not just face the truth? Face the facts and come clean. In Nayli's mind, that would be a lot more honest than giving her delusions. Sighing sadly, she went to the kitchen, but Vincent intercepted her at the door. Where do you think you're going? What if you get sick on the stairs or in the kitchen? No. I'll cook it myself and bring it to you. Nayli looked sadly at her husband. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your concern, but I want to make my own tea and breakfast. I want to feel like a woman again, not a bedridden sick woman. Vincent nodded understandingly and put his arm around her shoulders, of course. Nayli, you're right. I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking. Let me help you downstairs. A happy smile played on Nayli's lips. What a caring husband she had. He would sacrifice everything for her. When she entered the kitchen, she glanced around and closed her eyes blissfully. As usual, it smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, which she loved. In fact, cooking was everything to Nayli. As a wealthy woman, she could dine in restaurants and cafes every day, but she still liked to make her own dishes, the kind that would make her drool and make her dizzy. Pancakes, buns, fritters, Nayli knew it all, as well as anyone. She mixed the batter herself and stood at the stove. Even now, from time to time, she found the strength to make something tasty for her husband. Naturally, Vincent was against it. Nayli, but you have to take care of yourself. The kitchen can wait. Trust me, it won't be a big deal if I buy food at the store or order delivery from a restaurant. That's when you'll delight me with your culinary masterpieces. Nayli nodded in agreement and almost lost her balance when she felt a bout of dizziness. That's what I'm talking about. Sit down, get some rest. Sam called, said he'd be late today. And I called the notary, Vincent said, and began fussing over his wife. A notary? Why, Nayli wondered. Vincent hesitated for a moment, then came at the question from a distance, why? So that if anything happens, the firm won't be left without management. After all, it feeds us and keeps us out of medical expenses. You know that good drugs cost a lot of money nowadays. Nayli looked at her husband anxiously. What do you mean by in case of emergency? What's that supposed to mean? Have you buried me already? He lowered his eyes bashfully, realizing he had said too much. No, Nayli, I haven't, of course not. I don't even think about it. It's just that things happen in life. You know that as well as I do. Treatment can take a long time, and we can't take away the company's management. You're technically the owner of the company. And you're the one who makes all the decisions. So I'm trying to think 2 steps ahead. There was resentment in Vincent's voice. Nayli sensed it immediately. Why was she getting so worked up about this notary? In fact, her husband was right. Sickness was sickness. But business had to move forward, not stand still. I'm sorry, Vincent, you're right. Let him come, but only in the morning, okay? I've been feeling a little dizzy since the meds. I think handing over the reins of the firm at a time like this would be the right thing to do, Nayli said, letting her husband know that she was willing to make concessions. Well, that's great. Glad you heard me, honey. I was starting to feel a little awkward. And I've sketched out a few things in my will just in case. Nayli, don't think anything bad. So that you don't feel so sad, let's do it together. After all, we're wealthy people, we can't just let things go. Vincent said it in a voice so casual, so devoid of intonation, that Nayli felt uneasy. Was it possible to speak so calmly and coldly about such unpleasant things? When Vincent caught the change in her mood, he changed the subject with the virtuosity of a talented magician. In spite of all his tricks, Nayli still felt a lingering residue. She looked out the window, watching the leaves swirling in the wind, creating whimsical images of yellow and red. Involuntarily, Nayli remembered how she had ventured out for a walk in the park a month ago. She had met a woman fortune teller. She was in her early 30s, maybe a little older. At first glance, not everyone could recognize her as a fortune teller. Ordinary, modest clothes, no gypsy outfits or voluminous dresses. A dress and a small flower, a purse on her shoulder, and a notebook in which the fortune teller wrote down what she saw in the future clients. This was the first time Nayli had encountered such a method of divination. Usually all sorts of healers and mediums like to put on fog and other mystical tinsel. But here everything happened quite differently. The fortune teller approached only those whom she herself had chosen from the general mass and, touching her hands, said what she saw. At the same time, she behaved calmly, confidently, as a true professional of her work should. Nayli could not be more precise about her age because of the shawl that covered the woman's head. She approached Nayli on her own, as if she sensed the call for help coming from her. Though at that moment Nayli felt much better than she did now. "I see something is troubling you," the stranger said first. Nayli timidly looked up and noticed a boy of about 7 or 8 years old hovering near the fortune teller. A son, I suppose she thought at once. But she answered the question nevertheless. "Yes, you are right. I am worried. I am seriously ill, it seems, and the treatment does not help. Although maybe it all seems to me only to me." The companion gently touched Nayli's hand and then said, changing the conversation to you, "I see you're dreaming of children. And that's your main problem. But with that man, with whom you have tied your life, you will never have children." Such an unpleasant truth made Nayli uncomfortable. "Yes, you're right. It really is like that. But how do you know?" The fortune teller hesitated for a moment, then said simply, "I see. It is my cross to bear for the rest of my life." Nayli reached for her purse, but the fortune teller gently withdrew her hand. "No need, I'll make do. I don't take money from people. That's not good. Just groceries. And there's no need to thank me." Nayli was confused and froze with her purse in her hands. "You need to think about your health and take a closer look at your surroundings," the fortune teller added. At first, Nayli thought that the fortune teller worked according to a well-established scheme, selecting from the crowd of passers-by those from whom she could extract more profit. Take her, for example. You can see that Nayli is young and in the park walks by herself without a child. So there's a good chance there's a problem with that. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out the root of the problem. Nayli would never have believed the fortune teller if she'd charged her for her services. But she refused. She also hinted at problems with her inner circle. What does she mean by that? On that warm September day, Nayli thanked the fortune teller, but she did it through her son. Calling the toddler over to her, she pointed him to the bakery stall and asked with a smile, "How do you feel about having lunch?" The boy looked furtively at his mom and then said, "Yeah, I don't mind, actually. Just don't go to waste on me. 1 bun and juice will be enough, if you can have it orange-flavored." Nayli smiled. As of late, socializing with small children had brought her peace of mind and satisfaction. "Well, let's go, if Mommy doesn't mind," Nayli said, and headed towards the nearest kiosk. "Mom doesn't mind," the fortune teller replied after her, bringing a smile to Nayli's face. Of course, she bought a lot more than the boy had asked for. As it turned out a little later, his name was Andrew, and his mom was Martha. The fortune teller did not join the meal, leaving her son together with Nayli on the bench. She herself stood a little farther away, giving advice to another client. "Your mom is serious, and she seems to have a special gift. I've never seen anything like it," Nayli said casually. Andrew nodded and chewed a piece of bun and drank a good sip of juice. "Yeah, my mom's great. Everything she says comes true. It's a pity she can't tell herself anything," she says. "Sees only for strangers." Nayli looked at the boy with a smile. So small, and yet he talks like an adult. They chatted for about half an hour and then parted as friends. Nayli waved goodbye to Martha, hoping that they would meet again sometime. But they never did, for over the past month Nayli's health had deteriorated considerably, and she could not find the strength for another walk, though from time to time she thought of her meeting with little Andrew, and the thought of him always brought a sweet smile to her lips. Once Nayli had even tried to tell her husband about it, but he had not been understanding. "Why are you listening to some quacks? You are being treated by a qualified doctor, not a village witch doctor. And all these prophecies are pure fiction and lies. You see how many of them there are lately. They're used to living at other people's expense. And they don't want to work. It's easier to fool people and get paid for it," Vincent reacted sharply. Honey, I was just saying that. I didn't mean it. It wasn't anything serious. I just liked Andrew," and his mom Nayli retorted, her lips pressed together resentfully. During that conversation, sensing the change in her voice, Vincent had decided not to pursue such an unpleasant topic and had turned his attention to something else. What Nayli didn't know was that afterward she had been too lazy to find Martha in person to give her an opinion on her prophecies. "Listen, you half-baked witch, don't interfere with my family's life. My wife and I will figure out what to do and when to do it. And you and your predictions, go fool someone else." During his angry tirade, on Martha's face did not shake a single muscle. She was letting Vincent know that she wasn't afraid of him and that she was ready to go all the way. "I only tell people what I see, and all my predictions have come true. That means I've helped others and kept them from making irreparable mistakes." Vincent relented. He gave her a hateful look and turned his back and walked away. Martha stared after him for a long time, feeling a growing uneasiness. This was usually the case when a person was in real danger, and Nayli had to be rescued. As they approached the McCullough house, Nick honked his horn, and after a couple of seconds, the automation kicked in. The gate slowly opened, and Vincent was already waiting for him in the yard, patting the notary's shoulder confidingly. "Good to see you again," Nick the host said. "Here's the thing. I'd like to mention it in person while Nayli can't hear. The fact is, she's seriously, very seriously ill, "Is it really that bad?" Nick asked anxiously. "Are the doctors doing everything they can?" "Yes, only the result so far is extremely disappointing. That's why I'm forced to make this difficult decision. There's no telling what might happen. After all, if Nayli dies, the family business will just be bled dry, I mean, it's just a matter of this and that. And the competition's still out there. They're just about to take our piece of the pie." The notary looked at the owner of the house with distrust. To tell the truth, Vincent McCullough was not a pleasant person to talk to. The businessman's behavior was alarming and illogical. His wife was dying, and all he cared about was business, even though all the assets belonged to Nayli. After all, it was she who managed to accumulate the initial capital by working on the stock exchange. Having led it to develop his own business, according to Nick, Vincent came to everything ready to go. When Nathalie McCullough was firmly on her feet and could compete with many of the successful businessmen of the city and region, the notary was brought out of his state of anxious reflection by the ingratiating voice of the landlord. "Well, I think the formalities are over. Then we can go into the house. Nayli's probably waiting for us by now." Nick nodded and pulled his hand out of his coat pocket and headed inside. At that moment, he didn't even notice the note the fortune teller's son had given him fall out of his left pocket. Vincent did not yawn, however, and picked it up from the leaf-strewn pavement. He waited for the guest to enter the house, then quickly unfolded the note and ran his eyes over it. The note contained only a single phrase, "Take care of your wife." Vincent's face contorted into a grimace of displeasure. "Is that what this is about? I don't need to take care of my wife anymore." "Well, we'll see, he muttered to himself. Folding the note, Vincent walked over to the trash can and immediately discarded it. That's a lot better than the kind of people who throw notes around and cause confusion between spouses. Seeing a pale as chalk Nayli, Nick involuntarily flinched. "What, do I look that bad?" she asked ironically. "No, Nayli, it's fine. It's just that you've lost so much weight noticeably." Nayli sighed sadly. "Well, you see, that means there's more to come. Other people are on diets 24 hours a day, but I'm losing weight." Having exchanged a couple of joking remarks, Nayli suggested the notary to get down to business. At that moment, Nick remembered the note the boy had handed him. "Wait a minute, Nayli. I have this thing that was passed to you by a kid. Funny one, he also has a mom who's a fortune teller. I think they kind of work at the park." Nayli smiled understandingly. "Ah, that must have been Andrew. He's a good boy. Where's that note?" Nick carefully checked one pocket, another, but the note was nowhere to be found. "I'm sorry, Nayli, I'm terribly embarrassed. But apparently I lost that piece of paper somewhere. Maybe in the car or in the yard." "While I was walking to the house," Nick said thoughtfully, blushing to the roots of his hair. At that moment, Vincent McCullough entered the living room. Casting his guest a mocking glance, he said, "Weren't you the one who lost the note in the yard? It fell just above the rainwater drain grate." Nick instantly perked up and a light of hope flashed in his eyes. "And what about it? I hope she survived." Vincent grinned wickedly. "Survived? I'll bet she did. She fell right into the sewer drain. So Nick, no offense, but I'm not much of a diver." The notary exhaled disappointedly. Vincent guessed from his guest's reaction that he knew nothing of the note's contents. "I wonder who handed him that piece of paper. What difference does it make? The important thing is that the evidence is destroyed. All the rest is trivial," Vincent thought as he sat down beside his wife. Saddened by the loss, Nick filled out the necessary paperwork in silence. He felt that he had failed not only the boy, but Nayli herself. It was possible that the note might have contained something important, but it didn't seem to make any sense now. Throughout the whole procedure, Nayli felt unwell. The persistent dizziness and nausea prevented her from concentrating on all the nuances of the notary's case. Finally, when everything was finished, she signed the necessary papers and exhaled in relief. "There, we've done it. A will at 32. Would anyone believe such a thing?" Nick lowered his gaze in embarrassment. As a man of intelligence and foresight, he'd realized before he'd visited the house that Vincent had been the one who'd initiated the will. Now, in the event of Nayli's death, he would receive not only her entire business, but also all the financial assets lying in some of the world's banks. But Nick didn't care much about these subtleties. The point was quite different. The notary was concerned that Nayli was so irresponsible about her health. If she didn't think about herself, who would want her? The answer to that question could only be given by Nayli herself, but judging by her passive mood, she was in no hurry to do so. Nick left McCullough's house and looked around the yard once more. Vincent hadn't been lying. The note was nowhere to be seen. With a resigned wave of his hand, he got into the car and started the engine. Unfortunately, the pang of guilt was still there, gnawing at his soul like a wild, hungry beast. "I promised the boy I'd give him that note, didn't I? And the boy wouldn't have come to my house at the crack of dawn if there hadn't been something important in that message," the notary pondered. Nick turned to the highway. His mood was completely ruined. He was going to visit his sick father. A nurse was a nurse, but Hector had no one closer than his son. Nick had always been proud of his dad. The bus driver had spent half his life behind the wheel and knew almost everything about engines. Nick remembered well the times when he and his father traveled around the city, sitting next to the window in the cabin of the bus. And he also liked to go with his dad and his colleagues to picnics and rather nice sit-downs by the fire with baked potatoes, fried sausages, and pickles. All this idyll was cut short in an instant when Hector's bus was involved in a terrible accident, colliding with a truck that had lost control. In fact, the driver of the truck was not at fault, because the front wheel burst on the move completely deprived him of maneuverability. From the strong impact, the interior of the bus caught fire, and there was panic among the passengers. Nick did not know all this then, and read about the incident only in the newspapers. The impact was so strong that the bus driver was trapped in the cabin, and in case of fire it reduced his chances of survival to zero. Passengers jumped out of the flaming bus, and quite expectedly thought only of themselves. Nick's father was already mentally saying goodbye to his life when a miracle happened. He was helped out of the burning bus. And the most amazing thing was that the rescuer of Hector was a girl. Unfortunately, at that moment he had already lost consciousness and did not have time to ask the name of the young heroine. Nick's father was lucky he survived. True, to call full-fledged this life was no longer possible. In the accident, Hector injured his spine, from which he was confined to a wheelchair for many years. Of course, Nick did everything possible for his father, but his health was deteriorating by the day. But the young notary did not lower his hands. He provided his father with proper care, hiring a nurse and paying for the services of a private doctor's house call. The longer Nick thought about Nayli's will, the more he realized that something was wrong with the case. Even very wealthy people try to be treated in special institutions, but not at home as Nayli did. And where does her husband look? Doesn't he see anything? Or maybe he's just pretending? Tired of puzzling over what was in the note, Nick decided to find a fortune teller and personally ask her what happened. To do so, he called the receptionist and canceled the appointment. He found Martha almost immediately. This was partly thanks to Andrew. Nick saw him right away. "Oh, Uncle Lawyer is back," exclaimed the boy and began to jump on the spot. "Not a lawyer, but a notary, son. Believe me, they are two completely different fields," Martha corrected her son. "Hello. Did you deliver the note to Nayli McCullough?" Nick got straight to the point. "Yes, that's right. I hope you delivered it to the address," she asked. Nick lowered his eyes in embarrassment. "Unfortunately, I couldn't do that. Let me ask you, what was in that note?" Martha suddenly turned pale. Slight wrinkles appeared in the corners of her eyes. She still wore a headscarf on her head, making her look like a villager. "Nayli is in danger. I wrote to her to be careful with her husband," Martha replied in a shaky voice. Nick shook his head uncomprehendingly. "But how did you know about it? And why did your son come to me with the note in the first place?" Martha's face seemed carved out of plaster. No one could understand what she was feeling at that moment. Finally, the fortune teller answered. "I had a dream tonight. It was more like a vision. It involved you, Nayli, and her husband. That's why I asked for your help." Nick looked at her doubtfully. Does she really think that he will believe in all this mystical nonsense? No, but it's ridiculous. Dreams, omens, it's pure fraud, that's what it is. However, Nick didn't say it out loud and only asked one question. "You forgive me, of course. But in general, what is the error rate of your predictions?" "My mom always tells the truth. She had a real gift after she was almost killed on a bus. Well, just like that superhero from the cartoon," intervened in the conversation Andrew. Andrew interjected. Nick turned pale and asked, addressing Martha rather than her young son. "On the bus? A fire on a bus 8 years ago? I didn't mishear that, did I? My father worked on that route. Hector, maybe you know." The fortune teller's lips treacherously quivered and tears welled up in her eyes. "Yes, I know your father. Not personally, of course. I'm the one who pulled him off the bus. I saved him. I suffered severe burns to my head. The wounds healed over time, but the scars remain. That's why I wear a scarf to cover the burns." Now it was Nick's turn to be surprised. God, is it possible? I had thanked my father's savior so many times in my mind, and I had no idea that one day I would be able to thank her. Martha lowered her eyes in embarrassment. "That's what anyone in my position should have done. In a way, I'm even grateful to your father and what happened." The notary looked at her in surprise, a mute question in his eyes. Martha nodded and continued. "I had gone to terminate the pregnancy that day. I was a naive fool. I believed the restaurant manager's son, and I fell in love. As the epiphany came, it was like a bucket of ice water poured on my head. 4 to 5 weeks pregnant, my fiancé didn't talk much. He just handed me the money and sent me to the hospital. I was crying the whole way, stupid me. I couldn't make up my mind, but when that accident happened, I immediately realized what I had to do. I made a vow to myself, if I survive, I'll keep the baby and become the best mom in the world. And if I didn't, then how could I be of any use? Martha's confession shocked Nick to the core. Looking at Andrew, who was standing nearby, Nick smiled and winked at him. The boy took the baton and responded with a thumbs-up gesture of approval. Martha gave her son an affectionate look and turned her attention back to Nick. After the incident with the bus, I started having visions. At first I thought it was the result of the trauma, but the truth was a little different. My grandmother told me that there were fortune tellers and clairvoyants in our family, but the chain of gifted people was broken. But I have a gift again. Unfortunately, I can only see the coming danger that threatens a particular person, and nothing more. Nick looked at Martha with respect. After all, if it weren't for her, his father would have died on that bus, which had become a fire trap for him. So you think Nayli is in danger? Nick broke the silence. I don't even doubt it, and I'm 200% sure of it. The notary hesitated. The fortune teller's words definitely made sense, but Nayli looked calm. She'd signed the papers herself. It was hardly forced, but it wouldn't hurt to take a closer look at the McCullough house. Returning to this, Nick began to mentally go over those who could help him in this difficult task. But no matter how much he thought, he could not find a suitable candidate. At the same time, Vincent McCullough, with a sense of accomplishment, took Nayli to her room and helped her to bed so that she could get some rest before the doctor arrived. When he was satisfied that his wife was asleep, he quietly closed the door and hurried to the hall, where he intended to make one very important call. Deciding that Nayli was already dreaming for the 10th time, Vincent turned on the video call, as he had done so many times before. He waited for quite a while. When he was desperate, a sleepy girl's voice came through. "Yes, darling, hello. Did you want something?" Vincent bit his lip in impatience. "Of course I wanted something. Mavis, it worked. You hear that? She made a will in my favor." "Who did? Your wife?" Vincent cringed. "Well, yes, she did. Who else? Now all we have to do is bide our time and we'll be in business." There was a touch of resentment in Mavis's voice. "There we go, waiting again. Our babies won't wait. I already went to the ultrasound. I didn't wait for you. You're always busy. Imagine we'll have twins. What's not to help a rich dad like you?" Vincent sighed convulsively. What a stroke of luck. How could he have hoped to be the father of two beautiful babies at once? Nayli was a rotten vessel, with her pockets full of money and no way to get pregnant. Just be patient. Things will change soon. There'll be a holiday on our street too. You mark my word. Yes, what else? Your brother's coming. Remember today? I'll expect him at 3. Make it look real. He should take his robe too, because he always has stains on it. He's a doctor at a private clinic, Vincent said in a businesslike tone. Okay, I'll tell him. All right, I'll see you later, Mavis whispered languidly, and disconnected the call. There you go, as usual. I didn't have time to say a word to her brother, Vincent exclaimed resentfully. In the back of his mind, he saw himself as the head of the McCullough financial empire. How could he not, with Nayli's time running out? The medicines he and his fake Dr. Sam had given Nayli were just harmless vitamins and nothing more. It was a very different kind of illness. The plan of Vincent and his mistress was for Nayli to pass away on her own, without any poisoning or other crime. The thing was, he was scared to death of going to prison, where the unwritten laws reigned. Mavis's brother, Sam, just laughed. Come on, there's nothing to be afraid of. I've done 2 terms, and I'm alive and well. But you're wrong to refuse the poison. I'm working at the morgue now as a corpsman. I can arrange for the body not to be cut open. I've got the connections. But Vincent didn't want to hear anything about crime. Instead, he had devised a very clever scheme whereby Naley was to escape from complications of a disease that no one was actually going to treat. Thus, Brother Meavies would come to their house from time to time, and after examining Naley, would give her a new batch of what were simply vitamins. Sam played his part skillfully, having heard all sorts of medical words and terms in the morgue. He used them like a sleeve. The only problem was the tattoos on the bones of his hands. Vincent had wanted to use makeup at first, but Mavis had suggested that he take the easier route and simply wear medical gloves. The theatrics worked well during the examination of the patient. For weeks now, Naley had been taking vitamins instead of expensive broad-spectrum drugs. Today, too, Vincent couldn't help but worry as he waited for Sam to arrive. His worries were unnecessary, though, because everything had gone smoothly with the notary. Of course, it wasn't easy to persuade Naley to remain calm and continue to believe in the power of the pills. It's nothing. She's been so dumb lately that she won't be able to put 2 plus 2 together, Vincent thought with a wry smirk on his lips. If only he'd known that right now Naley was watching him, standing at the railing of the second-story staircase, staggering from side to side from exhaustion when she hadn't swallowed the sleeping pills. After witnessing Vincent's creepy confession during the video call, Naley couldn't believe herself. Could it all be a hallucination? But that's what happens when people have delusions. She was experiencing something like that right now. She was seeing things that couldn't be real. But no matter how much Naley rubbed her eyes or pinched her shoulder, it was still the same. God, what to do now? Where to run to? Who to ask for help? A phone. I need a phone. But I'd given it to Vincent so that the calls and notifications wouldn't interfere with my sleep. God, I'm such an idiot. Naley's mind raced. But it was too late to tear her hair out. While Naley agonizingly searched for a way out of the situation, Nick decided to go back and have a thorough talk with her husband. The young notary had not thought through the strategy of the conversation and, as it often happens, hoped against hope. Many people knew that if necessary, Nick could dumb down anyone, because at the beginning of his career he worked as a criminal defense lawyer in the city court and masterfully knew how to confuse the situation. But as he pulled up to McCullough's house a second time, his attention was caught by a thin young man in his mid-30s, short-cropped hair, a wary, scratchy gaze that smelled cold. Wait, where could I have seen him before, wondered the notary. The stranger approached the massive gate of the McCullough house and pressed the bell button several times. Nick took a closer look and almost lost his senses at what he saw. Oh, it's Sam Zotov. That's right. I defended him in court a few years ago. Robbery as part of an armed group. How long ago? That was 5 to 7 years ago. He hasn't changed much. Still the same angry look and hedgehog haircut. Nick's suspicions only grew stronger after what he'd seen. What kind of business could Vincent and Sam be in? Especially since one of them was a longtime pilot and the other a possible heir to his wife's vast financial empire. When she heard the doorbell ring, Naley flinched. Surely it must be the doctor in disguise showing up again. What's his name? Sam. Honey, get up. The doctor's here for a checkup, Vincent announced in a well-practiced voice. Naley went quietly back to her room to feign sleepiness after the unplanned awakening. I'll be right back. I'll just tug on my robe. Okay, and her spouse was already meeting her accomplice in the living room. Winking at each other, the conspirators exchanged a firm handshake and walked leisurely to Naley's room. How's Mavis? Oh, it's great. Such a person. Last time she called, she was so excited. The disguised doctor looked at him sideways and hissed quietly. What do I know? Do you think she's reporting this to me? Vincent nodded in agreement and was about to open the door to his wife's room when he heard the ringing of a bell from downstairs. Sam looked at Vincent with obvious disapproval. What are you doing? Waiting. Couldn't you have invited me some other day? I didn't invite anyone. What's the matter with you? "I don't even know who it is." Vincent was indignant and went to open the door. He was surprised to see the notary smiling embarrassedly at the door. "Here, Nick, what have you forgotten? Or did something happen?" Nick shifted his gaze to the guest in the medical coat and realized that he recognized him too. A second later, a knife glinted in Sam's hands. Of course, he recognized the former lawyer who had never been able to save him from a criminal conviction over 8 years ago. "Where is he, Vincent? Did he expose us?" screamed the disguised recidivist and lunged at Nick with the knife. Vincent hesitated for a moment, giving his guest precious time to make a decision. But Nick didn't make it out of the house in time. As he fell under the hail of blows, he realized that he had been foolish to go into that dangerous place alone. The forces were clearly not on the side of the notary, who was not a strong man, being thin and wiry. Perhaps, if this Dr. Bandit had not had a knife, Nick would have been able to get out of the situation unharmed. But when he felt a sharp pain in his lower abdomen, he realized that time was running out in minutes, maybe even seconds. His eyes immediately darkened, and his mouth felt a nasty bitterness that made him acutely thirsty. Falling to the floor, Nick didn't know that at that very moment Naley had already gotten to the phone and was calling the nearest police station. Nor did he hear the sirens of the patrol cars that had surrounded the house in minutes, blocking all entrances and exits. The last thing that stuck in Nick's memory was the crying eyes of Naley, who had witnessed the drama that had unfolded during the arrest by the police. Vincent had tried to pass himself off as a victim, blaming Sam's accomplice, but it didn't work out so well. Handcuffed, they went to the police station, where they had a long, detailed conversation with the local operatives. The badly wounded Nick was taken away by ambulance, but Naley refused to be hospitalized because the next day she was going to undergo a full examination in one of the clinics. The most affected by this situation was a young notary, who happened to be in the center of events. Despite the fact that Nick's operation was carried out in time, he was still in a critical condition. All to blame was the traumatic shock he experienced during the wounding. During the interrogation, Vincent denied everything. He tried to accuse Sam of all the deadly sins, but for such a stubborn suspect, the investigator had his own tricks. One of them was a certain amount of credible information obtained during an interview with a repeat offender. Posing as a doctor. That's where Vincent got a big surprise. Mevis and Sam weren't actually related. They were secretly involved in a love affair in which they were expecting a future twin. The conspirators' calculation was simple. By deceiving Vincent, the couple intended to rob the wealthy heir to the ground after he had gotten rid of his rapidly declining wife. It was a huge blow to Vincent, whose line of defense was deeply breached. Only now did he realize that all this time Mavis had been deceiving him, using him for her own ends. It happened to be the tragic outcome Martha had envisioned when she had tried to warn Naley of the danger. She didn't consider the wealthy businesswoman a friend or close acquaintance. She'd probably do it for anyone who needed help one way or another. "And Nick's children died?" Andrew asked sadly. "Yeah, I saw the story on the news," he added quietly. Martha gathered her son's unruly hair and quietly replied, "No, he's alive, son, only in a coma. And when he'll come out, no one knows. I think we should go and see him." "Yes, of course, we'll go by all means. When?" "Today, tomorrow," Andrew said animatedly. Martha shook her head. "Nobody. In a couple of days, it will be fine." Naley, remembering the bravery shown by Nick, took care of all the expenses related to the operation and subsequent rehabilitation. But the most important news awaited the businesswoman a little later, when she learned the results of her tests. "My God, I don't have oncology. There was a mistake during the last examination." "Yes, it's a miracle," Naley tearfully exclaimed. Of course, it was still too early to be truly happy, because she had a long course of treatment ahead of her under the care of experienced real doctors of the highest qualification. At the same time, she never forgot what Nick had done for her. When she entered his room, she could not hold back her tears. Next to the motionless body of her son, sitting in a wheelchair, was Nick's father, Hector. The disabled man's hands were trembling with excitement. Tears were streaming down his cheeks. The former bus driver arrived at the hospital despite the prohibition of the nurse and the attending physician, which shocked the medical staff to the core. At that moment, the door of the ward creaked softly, and Martha and Andrew appeared on the threshold. They had all gathered to pay their respects to the man who had risked his life to save others. "I think we need to speak to him aloud," someone in the audience pronounced. "There is an opinion that it is the best remedy in such cases," Nayli suggested quietly. In the short time she had been undergoing the treatment, her cheeks had turned pink again, and a mischievous glint had appeared in her eyes. "Agreed," Martha nodded, confident that Nick was hearing every word perfectly. "So I can sing a song?" Andrew asked with a smile. "Of course you can, just quietly. Otherwise you might wake up the whole ward." Nayli smiled and winked at the baby, remembering the day they had first met. The weeks flew by. Finally, Nick came out of his coma, and his first phrase was, "Where's my dad?" All this time, Martha, Nayli, and Hector were on alternating duty in the room, patiently waiting for him to return to the world of the living. As it happened, the moment of awakening fell precisely on Martha's shift, who greeted him with a smile on her face. She was also without her customary shawl, which skillfully concealed her burn scar. "And it suits you very well. Why don't you not wear it anymore?" "Okay," Nick whispered with a smile and closed his eyes tiredly. Martha touched his hand gently, sending a pleasant wave of shivers through his entire body. She'd been in Nick's room almost every day since then. She also took Hector with her, so that the lonely father wouldn't have to go through the separation so hard. The most happy about it was Andrew, who chatted with the former driver all day long about everything in the world, funny stories from his life, and retold someone else's road stories. By the time they were discharged from the hospital, Nick and Martha already considered themselves a couple and openly emphasized their status. How could it be otherwise when there was a love in their hearts that only grew stronger with each passing day? Looking at the lovers with a smile, Nayli sincerely rejoiced at their happiness. However, the businesswoman's joy was not groundless at all, because during her treatment at the clinic, she managed to get acquainted with a very nice therapist, raising a young daughter alone. After being discharged from the hospital, Nick returned to his old job, which he now liked even more. It is also rumored that the notary has become more careful in business and now checks the information received several times, especially when the issue concerns inheritance. Later, Martha and Nayli became family friends, never ceasing to amaze others with their successes. Nayli's wedding gift to Martha was plastic surgery, which almost perfectly removed all the unpleasant memories of the fire on the bus. Vivian decided to surprise her foreign fiancé and learned Italian, but accidentally overhearing his conversation. Before leaving the office, Vivian habitually looked at herself from head to toe in the large mirror by the door. Her blonde hair fell in waves over her exposed shoulders. The light dress beautifully outlined her slender figure. The length of her legs was emphasized by sandals on a low heel. The girl smiled at her reflection. Yes, she was completely satisfied with what she saw. She especially liked her own eyes, lately huge blue lakes, which now had a special light in them. They sparkled with joy, glowing with anticipation of happy changes. And love, of course. Yes, Vivian was in love for the first time in her 23 years. So much so that her heart jumped out of her chest at the mere thought of the person she loved. It turned out that all the romantic experiences that visited the girl before meeting him were not serious, even her feelings for Ben. "Yes, beautiful, beautiful. Do not doubt it," smiled Vivian Amili, a colleague about 15 years older than the girl. From the very beginning, she had taken care of the new young employee, who had just graduated from university, taking her under her wing. Vivian was grateful to Amili for that. "Thank you," she smiled radiantly at her colleague. "Where are you going after work?" "On a date with your Italian." No, Vivian shook her head. "You know, I decided to surprise him to learn Italian. It's the 10th lesson today, and I have to hurry." I decided not to tell him until later. He will be happy and surprised, of course." "That's right," said Amelie. "It is necessary to know the language. You never know." Vivian nodded, said goodbye to her colleague, and slipped out the door. A cab was waiting for her at the gate of the building. On the way to the language learning center, Vivian looked at the pictures on her phone. It was a long drive. The course was on the other side of the city. There was no place closer. English was taught in many places, but Italian only in this center. Apparently the language was not so popular, but it was easy enough to learn. Or maybe Vivian was so eager to speak the language of her beloved that she made rapid progress? Her teacher was very complimentary. Looking at the photos from last year's vacation in Rome, Vivian relived the pleasant moments over and over again. Here, against the background of St. Peter's Cathedral, she had no idea that a fateful meeting would soon await her. And here, not far from the Colosseum, Vivian had already fallen head over heels in love with the handsome Grace. He suddenly appeared in her life and immediately changed it, coloring it in 1,000 different colors, turning it into a kind of endless holiday. Energetic, lively, cheerful guy always infected Vivian with his positivity and good mood. And what compliments the temperamental Italian showered on the girl. They communicated in English. Vivian knew the language well, as she studied at a language school. Grace also knew it well, because she traveled a lot around the world and communicated with different people. The girl in general was incredibly open and sincere. She could find a common language with anyone. That trip to Italy was a gift from her parents. The girl graduated from the University of Economics with honors. Actually, economics never particularly attracted her. Vivian liked to take pictures. She got great pictures. She preferred portraits. Many noted that the girl managed to emphasize the inner beauty and uniqueness of people. "Yes, you are a real talent," more than once exclaimed Ben. The same Ben with whom Vivian was in love all her school years. But he only saw her as a friend. Between young people since childhood were warm, close relations, however, purely amicable. Girlfriends also praised Vivian in the photo and often asked to shoot them for social networks. "Nobody takes pictures of me as beautifully as you do, Trixie," a neighbor and part-time best friend declared. "There's no Photoshop required on these photos of you, because you're very beautiful yourself," Vivian smiled at her friend. "No," Trixie sighed. "I'm fat and I have a potato nose and small eyes. But in your pictures, yes, I'm beautiful. Too bad they're the only pictures. But you're really beautiful from every angle and in every light." Vivian knew it was true. Ever since she was a child, Vivian had heard people complimenting her on her looks. She was blonde with correct facial features and huge blue eyes, graceful, fragile, with translucent skin. Vivian herself would like her skin to be darker. But she did not even tan, no matter how much she used special creams. Friends and relatives chorused about the beauty and delicate appearance of her porcelain skin. So in the end, Vivian accepted her aristocratic pallor. Still, she had always liked swarthy people. They seemed bright, strong, incredibly attractive and beautiful. So after graduating from university, Vivian first went on a trip abroad without her parents. She was accompanied by the same faithful Trixie. She had long since earned money on her own after graduating from college and could afford to pay for the trip. It was an unforgettable vacation. The friends spent the first half of the day walking around the historical sites of Rome with a tour group, as part of which they came to Italy. And then they had their own time to get acquainted with the city. The girls visited everywhere. They saw all the sights, walked along the labyrinths of narrow, confusing streets, sat in restaurants and inspected showrooms. But the greatest pleasure for the friends was to spend time on the beach. The girls quickly realized how to get there. You take a train at the local station. Half an hour and you are already in a paradise place with white sandy beaches, where turquoise waves roll up on the shore. My friends usually settled down under a free umbrella, of which there were always plenty. They took turns going to the sea, one to look after things, the other to splash in the warm waves. At one of these moments, when Vivian was left guarding the beach bags, he approached her. Vivian had long ago realized that her appearance, blonde hair, pale skin is attractive to Italians. They are swarthy, with black hair, dark eyes. Blonde for them a miracle of wonders. The girl constantly received compliments on her appearance, and not only from men. Vivian, in turn, was charmed by Italians so friendly, smiling, and very, very beautiful. Vivian already had a lot of pictures of smiling, swarthy faces in her phone. You could make an exhibition, they were all so interesting, sincere, and lively. But Grace was special, the most special. Almond-shaped black eyes, a beautiful tanned body, a cap of curly hair the color of a crow's wing. Bright orange bathing shorts emphasized the darker shade of his skin. His arms and chest were literally burning with muscle. The guy had clearly spent quite a bit of time at the gym, but he didn't look skewed, just athletic. He then crouched down in front of Vivian, who was taking a salty bath, and smiled broadly at her. His cheeks formed charming dimples, which finally conquered the girl. "Hello," he said in not-so-perfect English. "My name is Grace. And you? How do you like the beach?" "I'm Vivian." From excitement, the girl could hardly form a phrase in English, although she knew it well since childhood. What English? Even in Russian, Vivian would not immediately find an answer. Such a handsome man. And not just handsome, but Grace had a special energy about him. He seemed to mesmerize Vivian with his black eyes and his open smile. "Beautiful," the young man grinned. "If you think this beach is beautiful, you haven't seen real beauty." Vivian could argue that she could see the real beauty right in front of her. "I wish I could take a picture of this handsome guy. But it's kind of embarrassing to ask." Usually the girl didn't hesitate to ask such a question to people. Only now it was different. Her heart was pounding in her chest like frantic palms in the gym. At the same time, Vivian desperately hoped that her interlocutor did not notice her excitement. "There's a deserted beach nearby, just next door, and only the locals know about it. There are no tourists there. And there, it's much better and more interesting," the guy told her, keeping his eyes on Vivian. In his gaze, the girl saw interest and admiration. Vivian knew, of course, that she had an attractive appearance. Others often looked at her that way. However, their gazes did not have such a hypnotic effect on the girl. It had never happened to her before. Vivian sat down on the towel. The boy, after asking permission, settled down next to her. From the realization that he cared for her, Vivian literally blossomed before her eyes. "This is so great. It's incredible," she exclaimed. "Why don't we go to that deserted and beautiful beach and go for a swim? You, me, and my friend. I've been watching you guys for a long time. I've noticed that you're not alone." Vivian tensed. The idea seemed both tempting and dangerous. After all, she didn't know this man at all. Although on an intuitive level, the girl already trusted her new acquaintance completely. Still, Vivian had always been distinguished by rationality. And she couldn't just go out with Grace like that. He noticed it and slapped his forehead with the palm of his hand. "I'm a fool. I didn't even think about what it looked like from the outside." "A stranger lures two girls into a deserted place," he said. "I'm sorry, I just lost my head at your beauty. Immediately I wanted to show you my favorite place, to share my impressions. My mom always says I talk first and think later, that's my trouble." Grace's remorse looked so comical that Vivian relaxed and smiled again. She wouldn't risk leaving the beach with a guy she didn't know, even if he was so handsome. But she didn't want to break up with him now either. If Grace left, they'd probably never see each other again. Rome is a big city. "Why? What if I invited you and your friend somewhere a little more crowded?" As if he'd read her mind, Grace suggested it. "For example, there's a disco in town tonight at my favorite bar. It'll be fun. Will you come?" Vivian immediately said yes. She'd definitely get Trixie to go to the event. She wouldn't even have to persuade her friend. She would be happy to spend the evening in a fun and interesting way. And then Trixie came to replace Vivian at her post. Seeing Grace, Vivian was a little embarrassed. Of course she was. Anyone would be confused by those beautiful black eyes. Trixie, always a little embarrassed by her fullness, stood half-turned toward Grace. She thought she looked slimmer that way. Vivian immediately realized that her friend was instinctively trying to present herself in the most favorable light. But after a couple minutes, Trixie's embarrassment was gone. Just like Vivian, she was mesmerized by the young man's every word and laughed at his witty jokes. The time flew by. The young people talked, becoming closer and clearer to each other. That day they laughed a lot, played beach volleyball, had fun on the beach. It was wonderful. Grace was polite, alert, and with Trixie. But both girls realized who was the real reason for his presence in this small company. Vivian melted with happiness as she caught Grace's admiring gaze. The sun was already sinking when they left for the hotel. "We must go," Vivian said regretfully. "I don't want to leave, but we have to get ready for tonight." "I'll be waiting for you," Grace smiled at them. "We won't be going away for long." "I don't know how to suggest it without scaring you. Why don't I give you a ride to the hotel? I have a car right here in the parking lot." The friends looked at each other. They both had the same thoughts in their heads. On the one hand, they didn't want to take the train and then spend half an hour in it. The girls were a little tired from the water and the sun, the abundance of impressions. And there was a party waiting for them, for which they had to prepare thoroughly. It was much better to spend some more time with the talkative, cheerful Grace. And I wanted to see his car. Grace seemed like a man you could trust. Except that if all intruders were like intruders, there would be no crime. The girlfriends had their doubts. Grace looked calmly at the girls, waiting for an answer. Vivian suddenly, without expecting it, blurted out, "Yes, give us a ride, please." "Thank you very much." It seemed to Vivian that if they refused now, Grace would be offended, and she didn't want to offend him at all. Trixie nodded with a smile, confirming her friend's words. Grace brightened. The parking lot was spacious yet packed. No wonder the weather was hot, and many people had flocked to the beach to enjoy the warm, gentle waves. Grace led the girls over to a beautiful sports car. Vivian and Trixie looked at it. They didn't know much about makes, but it was clearly not a cheap car. The sleek, dark green, streamlined, a little predatory and incredibly beautiful iron horse suited its owner very well. "Did you like my friend?" Grace smiled contentedly. "I've recently added to my collection. I love cars like this." Collection. Vivian suddenly looked at Grace with different eyes. There on the beach, he had seemed simple, natural, very close. But Grace must be very rich. He had a collection of automobiles. Vivian felt embarrassed again in his presence. Wealthy people are like representatives of another world. How to communicate with them, how to fit in. "Come on," Grace suddenly put his arm around Vivian in a reassuring way. His warmth and sincerity removed the awkwardness of the moment. The girls looked at each other and slipped into the cool cabin. The way he looked at you, Trixie shared her impressions in the room. She had already showered and was working on her hair, twisting it into tight curls. "If someone looked at me like that, how happy I'd be. Am I exaggerating?" Vivian argued. Now that Grace wasn't around, it seemed to her that she had made up his looks of admiration for herself, just because she wanted to. She'd gotten it into her head that this handsome man, who also happened to be rich, was looking at her in a special way. But in fact, Grace is just having fun, meeting cute tourists, having fun with them, just because he's sociable. And the blonde Vivian with her white skin and blue eyes is exotic for him. An interesting novelty, nothing more. "No way," Trixie exclaimed. "He's really fascinated by you." You could see it from the outside. Trixie's friend dispelled Vivian's doubts. "I'm even a little jealous." "Don't worry," Vivian said brightly. She was very encouraged by Trixie's words. "We're looking for a handsome man for you tonight." Grace picked the girls up exactly at the appointed time. The friends got into his car without any fear. This time the guy was on another iron horse, a black Mercedes. "I think this car is more suitable for the evening," he smiled, seeing the perplexity in the eyes of the girls. "Mercedes is elegant and beautiful, just like you." Vivian's attention was not lost on Grace, who looked at her with admiring eyes. It was no wonder the girl had done her best. She was wearing her favorite tight little black dress, emphasizing the graceful lines of her figure. It suited the girl, and she knew it very well. Diplomatic Grace showered compliments on both friends, but Vivian felt that his heart belonged to her. The guy didn't hide it. It was a marvelous evening, delicious wine, fiery dancing, fun until morning. Grace introduced the girls to his friends. There wasn't much socializing going on. First, the music was so loud that it was impossible to hear the interlocutor. Secondly, the language barrier. Not all of Grace's friends knew English. Nevertheless, the friends had a lot of fun. At the end of the evening, Grace even dared to kiss Vivian. They were dancing, pressed against each other, among a crowd of similarly heated young people. And then that kiss. Vivian was dizzy with surprise and emotion. "I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself," he smiled, looking his companion in the eyes. "You are so beautiful. You have no idea how beautiful you are." After these words, Vivian kissed Grace. He embraced her. It seemed to both of them that they were alone on the dance floor, but in fact they were surrounded by hundreds of people. Grace and Vivian met every day since then. At first, Trixie accompanied the couple everywhere, but soon she refused to be the third extra. "I feel like I'm just in the way, like the fifth wheel on a cart," she admitted. "No, you can have your romantic rendezvous without me," Trixie admitted. Vivian didn't mind. Indeed, she felt freer and happier alone with Grace. They took many walks. Grace showed the girl the sights that are usually inaccessible to the eyes of a tourist. The real old Rome, ancient and striking. And they also visited the beach, to which Grace had called her friends at the beginning of their acquaintance. It turned out to be a really beautiful place, hidden from prying eyes by low rocks. A kind of paradise cove. Soft sand heated by the sun, huge boulders, gentle waves, and nobody, absolutely nobody around. This piece of land was a whole world that belonged only to Grace and Vivian. "I want to live here with you forever, and never go anywhere," Grace confessed more than once, hugging Vivian, and she felt the same way. The young people got to know each other better and better. Grace told about himself. It turned out that he was the son of rich parents. His family owned several wineries. "We have a lot of vineyards in the province," Grace shared details of his life. "I have been accustomed to labor since childhood. I know everything about wine production from the very basics. My father says that the man who will get our empire must be able not only to give orders." Grace had an apartment in Rome, and he'd come here for a vacation once in a while, like now. But the guy lived with his parents in the province, near the largest of the family factories and a huge vineyard in the family estate. Apparently, it was a huge house with a beautiful, spacious garden and even a stable on the territory. Grace loved horseback riding. Recently, the guy, like Vivian, graduated from university. Only the girl studied economics and the young man studied management. Grace loved to travel. He told Vivian a lot about his trips, where the guy has not only visited Europe, Asia, Africa. Grace saw Stalinist monasteries and ruins of Mayan temples, admired the Grand Canyon, and photographed against the backdrop of Niagara Falls. Vivian listened to him with her mouth open in amazement. Wow! They were almost the same age. Grace had indeed traveled extensively and had a wealth of life experience, having worked in the family business since his youth. His generosity and attention to Vivian pays off. He gives her expensive gifts, pays all the expenses during their dates. His gallantry and aristocratic manners impressed the girl. At the same time, the upcoming parting is very hard for both of them. Vivian is very attached to Grace. He has become for her a literally vital person just for this short time. Grace also clearly does not want to part with his favorite girl. However, he tries to reassure her, saying that this is not the end, but only the beginning of their relationship. Their fates are already intertwined, and they will not lose each other despite the physical separation. Gracie is soon to leave Rome as well. It is obvious that very deep feelings have developed between them in this short time. A difficult period of separation awaits them, but they hope to continue their relationship despite the distance and obstacles. The final scene at the night fountain is very touching and romantic. Work, business. I only stayed in LA. For you. It was my happiest 3 weeks. They were my happiest, too, Vivian said, holding back tears. I don't want to break up with you. We'll keep in touch. Social networks, messengers. I'll write to you every day, even every hour. If you don't mind, of course. Of course, I'm all for it, exclaimed the girl. But such communication, it's still not the same. I understand. I'll miss you too. I've never felt like this before. And as soon as business permits, I'll come and see you right away. I'll do that. I'm looking forward to it. Vivian left in tears. Grace drove her friends to the bus station, where a tourist bus was waiting for them. For a while, the guy accompanied them on his sports car, and then he left. All the way Vivian looked at the photo of her lover. She took it on the eve of departure at the same fountain, where she couldn't stand it and cried in the arms of a young man. Grace smiled from the screen of the smartphone, but in his eyes read the sadness of the upcoming long parting. It was the photo that caught Vivian's eye now when she was browsing through the gallery section on her way to the language course. The girl smiled, remembering the touching moment. It seemed then that the separation would be eternal. Vivian had been afraid. Very afraid that Grace would quickly forget her. As they say, out of sight, out of mind. Vivian even shared her fears with the young man that last night and introduced him to a popular Russian, saying, "Well, I know another suitable phrase," said the boy, looking earnestly into Vivian's eyes. "Separation is like the wind, small passions are extinguished. But the big ones are only blown away. My feelings for you are so great that separation will only make them stronger and stronger. I miss you already." Grace kept his promise. He did write to Vivian often, sending cheerful messages, asking questions about her life, telling her about himself. Sometimes he sent her pictures of vineyards, sea, rocks. The lovers were constantly in touch. Surprisingly, Grace was right. Separation really strengthened their relationship. Young people recognized each other closer and closer. They became relatives, learned to feel each other at a distance. Grace periodically made surprises to his beloved. Hundreds of kilometers were not a hindrance for him. The guy often ordered the delivery of flowers and sweets. It was always unexpected and caused a smile and surprise to Vivian. She was pleased that Grace cared about her, trying to please her, even being so far away. On New Year's Eve, Grace gave her beloved a present. A courier delivered to her home an evening dress from a famous couturier. In it, Vivian went to the first corporate party in her life. There she made a real sensation. Men were lining up to dance with her. The lady did not refuse the cavaliers, but all attempts to continue the relationship stopped at the root. Her heart was no longer free. Vivian waited for Grace. He promised he'd come, so he would. The boy loves her so much. And Vivian was crazy about him. They're going to be together. Her parents knew about her daughter's relationship with a foreigner, but they didn't pay much attention to it. A holiday romance, Mom smiled. "I know how dizzying they can be. I know it from hearsay, by the way. Just don't count on anything. Relationships like that are quick to start, but just as quick to forget." Trixie, too, thought there'd be no sequel to the torrid affair. Californians are just temperamental, unlike our guys. They know how to woo. Grace is cool, but I don't think he's really coming. If he did, he would have been here a long time ago. I mean, it's been almost a year. But Vivian didn't believe what her family said. She knew that Grace was just busy. He was helping his father run his business. And that's not easy. Grace would come to see Vivian if he promised. There was a lot going on in the girl's life at the time. After returning from a memorable trip, Vivian got her first job in her life. Thanks to her father's connections, she was hired by a local oil company as an economist. The salary turned out to be such that the girl aghast when she saw the size of the transfer for the first time. Wow. So now I'll be able to provide for myself. And with a lot of dignity, Vivian exclaimed. "Well, we have a very grown-up girl," said on the day of the first paycheck at the family dinner Mom. "Maybe it's time for you to move out and start living on your own." "I think so, too," smiled the father, who looked proudly at his grown-up daughter, so beautiful, intelligent, and successful. A successful outcome of parental care and investment. Vivian clapped her hands with joy, just like a little girl. She had had her own apartment for a long time. Her father had bought it for her when she turned 18. "It's your future," he said then. The apartment was wonderful, spacious, bright, located in the center of the city. Vivian was afraid to imagine how much it cost. But then, as a student, she could not move into a new home. "You're not ready to live on your own yet," her mother said. "Let it stand for now. The apartment is not going anywhere. We'll renovate it slowly. And you study, you'll grow up. Then you will move in," nodded my father. And now, in the opinion of her parents, the daughter, who began to earn money herself, was quite ready to live separately. A new job, a new apartment, a new relationship, albeit at a distance. So many impressions, so many emotions. Life was booming, playing with bright colors. Vivian sometimes envied herself. All she needed to be happy was Grace by her side. Communication via video link was one thing, but the feeling of his warm hands on her shoulders was quite another. And recently he showed up at the doorstep of her new apartment. Grace had called the day before, unexpectedly, and warned him that he would send a courier in the morning with flowers and a small gift. When the bell rang, Vivian assumed it was a messenger. She opened the door and was stunned, unable to believe her eyes. On the threshold stood Grace. He was holding a bouquet of roses. The guy was smiling broadly. Vivian's legs even gave out. She gasped. Grace deftly took Vivian by the waist. They walked into the apartment arm in arm. She didn't go to work that day. She called her boss and took the day off. She couldn't leave Grace when he was finally around. That same morning, Grace proposed to Vivian. He didn't wait. "I want you to be my wife," he said, squeezing Vivian's wrist firmly but gently. "I realize that I cannot without you. This separation has not been easy for me. I thought of you every minute. I wanted to be near you all the time. I can't go on like this. Marry me. We'll go and live in my apartment in Rome, just you and me. Do you agree?" Vivian wrapped her arms around Grace's neck and kissed him instead of answering. Of course she agreed. Moreover, to hear such words from the lips of her beloved was her cherished dream, which was coming true right now. Her parents, having learned about their daughter's decision, of course, panicked at first. "How is it so? You will live in a foreign country, away from us. You never know. And what if they hurt you there?" Mom lamented. But after getting acquainted with Grace, my parents changed their opinion. The young man charmed them. They accepted the fact that the daughter will live in Italy with her beloved husband, and even rejoiced for her. And Grace generally liked everyone with whom Vivian introduced him. But you bet people are always attracted by sincerity, friendliness, sense of humor, energy. Grace had plenty of those. The only person who was not properly impressed by the handsome, wealthy Italian was Ben. Vivian frowned, remembering her childhood friend. He usually supported her in everything. How many times he had helped her out, protected her, comforted her. But this one was acting strangely. Trixie says it's jealousy. She says Ben's been in love with Vivian since he was a kid. That's why he won't accept Grace. But her friend is clearly mistaken. Vivian's been in love with Ben for a long time. What about him? He's only seen her as a friend from the beginning. When she was a teenager, she used to cry into her pillow at night because of it. What else could it be? She tried so hard to please her classmates. She chose outfits, did her makeup, tried to do her hair. And then she'd see him on the gymnasium in the arms of another girl. Was Ben the only one who found something in these girls? Vivian looked out the window of the cab as it passed the movie theater. How many times had she and Ben run here for horror movie screenings? Both loved such thrilling plots with unexpected turns of events. Vivian, of course, cowardly squeezed her eyes shut at the scary moments. Ben held her hand tightly, keeping his gaze on the screen. The girl hoped that someday in the darkness of the movie hall, her classmate would hug her. Maybe even kiss her, like his many girlfriends. But it never happened. "You're such a great friend," Ben said when Vivian let him copy his homework or help him with algebra. "You're so easy for me to talk to. Always accepting, always supportive. You're even better than the guys." Those were very dubious compliments for Vivian. She wanted Ben to see her not as a friend, but as her favorite girl. But it didn't work out. The childhood crush had faded. How many times can you knock on a closed door? But what remained were strong friendships. And Trixie? She doesn't get it. She got some other jealousy thing going on? Yeah, Ben's just teasing her, that's all. It's his usual way of talking to her. He called his friend's fiancée nothing but Angelica. Another convention. Too bad we don't know each other. I'd be texting her too, he said wryly. His name is Grace. What kind of name is that? I think it's feminine, masculine. It's actually Italian. Maybe your name sounds feminine to him too. It sounds like Andrea. Is that his cousin's sister's name? I don't care what he thinks it sounds like. He's Grace. That's all. Grace means angel, and Angel Ben is the one with the wings and the halo over his head. Thinking back on those joking exchanges, Vivian was smiling now. He's funny after all. Ben's sarcasm sometimes confused her, but Vivian was sure that if anything happened, he would come to her rescue. It would be a pity to part with him, friends and parents. But most importantly, Grace would be there for her, the man who made her heart beat so fast that it seemed to be about to jump out of her chest. Grace had been living with Vivian for almost 3 weeks now. Now he had the opportunity to leave the business for a while, but he had to return soon, and he intended to come home with his wife. The wedding was scheduled for the end of next month. It couldn't be sooner. All the nearest dates were taken. There were only a few weeks left. Preparations were in full swing at the mutual desire of the bride and groom. The wedding was to be a modest celebration in the circle of the closest people. True, the parents were a little disappointed. It turns out that they literally, from the birth of their little girl, dreamed of seeing their daughter in a bride's outfit and dance at her wedding to cheerful compositions. And here it is. And Grace's relatives aren't going to be there. As if the father cannot leave the business, and the mother, respectively, does not want to fly without her husband. Oh, that's okay. Then you'll get to know each other when you come to visit us, the daughter reassured her parents. We will show you Italy. Wonderful country. It's still strange somehow, not human, shook her head Mom. Even with the groom's relatives have not met once. But in the end, the parents accepted the decision of the newlyweds. The main thing that the daughter was happy. They saw the joy in Vivian's eyes when she was with Grace. Then so be it. The cab stopped at the porch of the Language Learning Center. Vivian paid the driver and went to class. Today was an interesting subject. Vivian was beginning to understand Italian speech, but only when people spoke slowly and clearly. And Grace, when communicating in his native language, spoke very fast. Basically, a lot of Italians talk like that. When the guy talked to his relatives or friends via video link, they answered him at the same pace, quickly and emotionally. Vivian could only make out individual words, and the meaning of the phrases eluded her. That was all right. Rome wasn't built at once either. She would learn. True, Vivian did not tell her fiancé about her lessons. She was preparing a surprise for the young man. He would be surprised when Vivian once addressed him in the purest Italian. The girl was fluent in English and French. Probably because of this, learning Italian was so fast. Vivian was far ahead of her classmates, so she was transferred to the next level ahead of schedule. And now she had almost mastered the next stage. Vivian wandered leisurely through the park in her own thoughts. The wedding date was approaching. Grace was still staying with her. It was wonderful. While Vivian worked, he cleaned the rooms, cooked delicious Italian meals. Often he would greet his fiancée with a perfectly set table plates with the next culinary masterpiece, a bottle of luxury wine, even candles. Life with him resembled a magical, romantic, beautiful fairy tale. What would happen when they moved to Italy? Lately, however, Vivian, who was making progress in Italian, began to notice something strange. Grace was often talking to someone, with a man's voice coming out of the receiver. It sounded like the person he was talking to was unhappy about something. Vivian could make out individual words, as it was hard to hear. Debt's police crook Grace kept reassuring the man, assuring him that everything would be resolved soon. He did it in an exaggeratedly calm tone. Probably so that Vivian would not guess the trouble. Most likely her lover did not want to upset her. The guy didn't even suspect that his fiancée now understood Italian, so he thought that the girl did not know about anything. And Vivian? She still shared her concerns with Trixie. Vivian shrugged her shoulders. Who else to share it with? Her parents had only recently gotten used to the idea of their daughter marrying a foreigner and moving to another country for permanent residence. No, they cannot be worried unnecessarily. There remains a faithful friend. She always listens and supports. What's so strange? Trixie dismissed it. He's a businessman. A business is always some kind of problem that has to be dealt with as it comes. It's just business as usual for him. That's why he seems calm. I think this man is threatening him, calling him a crook and threatening the police. I wouldn't worry if I were you. Your Grace will handle it. He's an experienced businessman. You're working yourself up, and he's not even paying much attention to the person he's talking to. But if you're so worried about it, just talk to Grace, and it'll all work out, Trixie suggested. No, Vivian smiled. I don't want him to know I'm learning Italian yet. Let it be a surprise. "You're a picture." Trixie grinned. "How do you want it?" Vivian wandered through the park where she loved to play with her friends as a child. Just next to the road, you cross it and the native yard, her parents' house. Today after work, Vivian decided to stop by her parents' house to pick up some documents. The upcoming meeting was a joy. The girl was quickly beginning to miss both her mom and dad. It was still unclear to her how she would be able to be without them for so long. You can't go to another country very often. Everything. So she would have to communicate through the laptop screen. By the way, Grace is as reverent as his fiancée is about her mother. He often calls her and talks to her via video link. Future mother-in-law Vivian is still a very young and spectacular woman. She has the same as her son's expressive eyes, black eyebrows, well-defined lips, and swarthy skin. And this woman's hair always looks like she just came out of a beauty parlor, dark, shiny, slightly curly. Yes, this lady is gorgeous. No wonder the wife of a successful businessman, owner of several wineries and hundreds of hectares of vineyards, must live up to her status. Vivian, too, would eventually become an elegant woman like her mother-in-law. Grace's mother smiled at Vivian from her laptop screen, spoke to her in Italian, and generally seemed friendly. Grace had said more than once that his mother was pleased with her son's choice. "You are a wonderful girl, very beautiful, sweet, well-mannered," he passed on the words of his mother. "And my mother also thinks that we will make wonderful children, her grandchildren, because we are very different in appearance. And such a mix of genes is always interesting." Vivian smiled then. At that time, she was not as fluent in Italian as she is now. That's why she couldn't communicate with her future relative who didn't know English, but she was very anxious to do so. Grace's mother seemed to be a very pleasant and interesting conversationalist. They will surely find a common language. It was true that more often mother and son talked on the phone. Vivian heard sometimes fragments of their conversations, only Grace's lines because his mother spoke quietly. They seemed to be discussing plans for the future. At least Grace kept promising her that everything would be fixed very soon, and he would fix everything as soon as he got there. Apparently, the woman just missed her son very much. "Vivian." "Hello," a very familiar male voice sounded behind her. The girl turned around and couldn't hold back a smile. Ben was rushing towards her, spreading his arms for a friendly hug. "How long it's been since we've seen each other. We used to spend so much time together." "You look great." Ben praised Vivian with an attentive look. Despite the fact that she would soon be Grace's wife, Vivian felt butterflies in her stomach at the compliment. Her body must have reacted in the usual way. Vivian had been secretly in love with Ben for so long, and he had only seen her as a friend. Yeah, Ben was a great friend. And from the bullies Vivian protected, and with the boys teased her in a manly talk, and in the evenings met a neighbor at the bus stop when her father could not. Vivian was choreographing at the time. Rehearsals ended late, and the road from the bus stop to home in the dark seemed dangerous to the girl. But next to Ben, smiling, cheerful, reliable, she always felt like behind a stone wall. They were classmates from the 1st to the 11th grade, sometimes even sitting at the same desk, but they were usually quickly seated. Ben shamelessly cheated from the excellent Vivian, and she only encouraged it. Of course, such a thing could not pass the attention of teachers, so they covered it up. But Vivian managed to pass the cheat sheets to Ben, even when they were sitting at different ends of the class. Ben was very good-looking, tall, athletic, cheerful, with green eyes framed by thick lashes and hair the color of ripe wheat. He had the right facial features. Since he was a little boy, he had been a joker and the soul of the company. He played sports and guitar. He also read a lot, though more fiction and adventure novels. If he swallowed textbooks with the same zeal, he would be an excellent student. But the guy was attracted to other things: socializing, parties, hiking. Around him always hovered people's secret and frank admirers, buddies, friends. He was like a magnet for adventure and often became the hero of interesting stories. His life was like a soap opera. Vivian used to be desperately jealous when she saw Ben strolling along with his girlfriend. But he never noticed. He told her about his girlfriends. At first, he admiringly described the girl's virtues, and after a while he shared his disappointment and sadness. Vivian always listened to his friend and, if necessary, supported him with a word or gave valuable advice. "You understand me like no one else," Ben confessed more than once. "It's even strange, as if you could read my mind." "It's because we grew up together," she smiled back. "I guess that's why it's so easy with you. It feels so good." Vivian nodded in response. She felt exactly the same way, only she also wanted Ben to hug her, to kiss her, to hold her close. Only Vivian had never once even hinted to the guy about her feelings. Why not? Because she was afraid, I guess. Because what if confessing would push Ben away from her? And even if it didn't, it would make things awkward between them. It's not going to be as easy and pleasant as it was before. No, let it go on as it was. However, once Vivian was still close to opening up to a childhood friend. Then 18-year-old Ben, a second-year student at a local engineering school, suddenly decided to get married. The news came as a thunderbolt to Vivian. She still hoped that one day the guy would pay attention to her not only as a friend. It happens. But if Ben gets married, Vivian's dream will not come true. The guy's girlfriend was a classmate. Vivian often saw them together. She was a spectacular person, with a lush shape and bright red hair. Not like Vivian herself, thin, almost transparent, and pale as a moth. At that moment, the girl saw herself as unassuming and unattractive. At least Ben's future wife certainly outshone her with her brightness and temperament. Before the wedding, Ben walked around a little anxious. He tried to behave as before, joking, having fun, making jokes. But Vivian could see that her childhood friend had something wrong with him. Why did you decide to get married so early? One day she dared to ask a direct question. I still have to study and study. I'll have to work here. What about university? Vivian knew that Ben had dreamed of becoming a ship mechanic since childhood. That's why he went to engineering school. It took a lot of hard work, but he did it. And he was very proud of it. You see, then looked seriously at Vivian. Ben, she's expecting a baby, so there's not much of a way out. Do you love her? Vivian blurted out before she could think about what she was saying. Yes, I do. Of course I love her, Ben said, a little uncertainly. How many tears Vivian had shed afterward, face buried in her pillow. Now she felt sorry not only for herself, who had lost her last hope of happiness with the man she loved. She felt sorry for Ben, too. She'd realized during that brief conversation that her friend was clearly unhappy, not by accident, because of circumstances. It had happened that way. Of course, Ben would marry the girl. He's always been honest and responsible, and then he'll spend the rest of his life suffering with a wife he doesn't love. Vivian sobbed over this life tragedy that could never be undone. But the wedding never took place. One day, Ben overheard the bride talking to another guy. In this dialogue, she admitted to that young man that the child is definitely his, swore, cited evidence, the timing of their dates. Her interlocutor clearly did not want to get married, so the lady had no other choice but to set up a date with Ben. You see, Ben shared the details of the story with Vivian. She told me over the phone that when she found out she was pregnant and I didn't want to get married, she decided to dump the baby on me. I didn't realize why she was so clingy to me at parties, even though she'd never noticed before. I was naive. After that night, she told me she was expecting a baby with me, and we need to formalize our relationship sooner rather than later. Of course, when Ben heard this dialogue, he demanded an explanation. His fiancée tried to make up something, somehow to get out of the situation. But Ben had already heard everything with his own ears. He then met with the child's real father to make sure, and he confirmed it. He also cursed Ben with a swear word and a naive young man. In the end, the man married his desperate girlfriend and recognized the baby, and Ben was spared having to live with someone he didn't love and learned a valuable lesson. So in the end, everything ended well for everyone. From then on, Ben became more careful. Now he was more careful about choosing girls and never made such mistakes again. Ben graduated from college and, as he had once dreamed, got a job on a ship as a mechanical engineer. Their town was located on the bank of a large, full-flowing river. Steamships and cargo ships traveled along it, so the demand for smart specialists was high. A river. It's great, of course, but I dream of big water. I wish I could go to the sea sometimes. Ben shared his thoughts with Vivian. But you have to move somewhere, don't you? Said the girl. Yes, you're right, Ben agreed. But it's for the best, new places, new life. It's getting crowded here. Vivian felt uneasy at the thought of not having Ben around. She was so used to him. She could call Ben at any time of the day or night to ask for help and know that he would be there. Ben had proven his reliability time and time again. He'd picked up Vivian and her friends from the nightclub when suspicious guys were hitting on them that night. The girls were afraid, but Ben came to pick them up in his used car. He had just recently gotten his license at the time, and his father had bought him a practice car. And with the repair of the roof at his father's cottage, Vivian helped. His parents even jokingly called the neighbor boy their son-in-law. He didn't mind. And once there was a funny case, Vivian stayed the night alone. Her parents had gone to the village to visit relatives. It was summer, it was hot, and suddenly the girl noticed a huge spider on the wall. She'd never seen such a thing before. It was the size of her fist. Of course, the girl squealed loudly and then dialed Ben. He rushed over and spent an hour trying to catch the monster. Finally, the guy managed to cover the spider with a pelvis and shove it into a jar. Later, it turned out to be the pet of their upstairs neighbor. He kept rare insects in his terrarium, and this spider escaped during feeding, and on some passages got to Vivian's apartment. The girl was grateful to Ben for all these situations. To know that you have a person who is always ready to help, it is worth a lot. Of course, Vivian didn't want him to go anywhere out of town, although her childhood crush, as she thought, had already passed at that point. But a trusted friend is even better. Lovers quarrel and separate, but friendship is forever. And now they met by chance in the park and were very happy to see each other. "Are you going to your parents?" Ben asked. Yes, Vivian smiled at him. "I'm getting the papers together because the wedding is coming up. Then we're going to Italy right away." "Italy?" Ben grimaced. "You've thought this decision over so well, haven't you?" "Of course I have. Why are you reacting this way?" "Why don't we sit down on the bench and talk?" Ben suggested. Vivian nodded. She didn't mind. She always enjoyed spending time with a friend. "You see," the boy began, as they settled down on the bench under the lantern. "It's a shame about that one, Grace." "His name is Grace," Vivian corrected angrily. She didn't like it when Ben called her fiancé so disparagingly. "All right, Grace is kind of slippery, insincere. I've seen him a couple times, but I've noticed that he's going out of his way to make everyone like him, and everyone's falling for it." "Everyone but you?" "Yes, except me." Ben nodded his head. "Don't you think you're making a big mistake now? You're safe here. You have friends, parents, a job, an apartment. You're protected from every angle and out there. I can't protect you there." That last sentence struck a deep chord in Vivian's soul. Ben. He was so used to protecting her that he was afraid to let her go to a foreign country because he couldn't look after her. "I don't need protecting," Vivian smiled at him. "Grace and I love each other. We have a wonderful relationship. I saw Trixie the other day. She says your husband's having some business problems." "What a talker," Vivian said jokingly. "Yes, I was sharing my worries with her. Grace was discussing his problems with someone on the phone. Well, it's okay, he'll get over it. Businessmen have problems all the time. They happen all the time. I wish he'd solved his problems first, then gone to his fiancée." Ben shook his head. "A normal man would have done that." "You're acting like the strict older brother I never had," Vivian grinned. "But it feels good. If you'd gotten to know Grace better, you might have liked him." "I doubt it," Ben shook his head. "He's slippery. He's got something dirty on his mind. I'm a good judge of character. That's why I almost married that redhead who tricked you into getting pregnant." He reminded Vivian of an incident from his youth. She thought the boy was going to smile and say something funny, but he only shook his head seriously and said, "Well, you compare. I was almost a child then, an 18-year-old kid. I'm not that man anymore. I can see Grace is up to something. I don't want you to be his victim or a means to some end." "That's ridiculous. He loves me. That's what Trixie tells me. And that Italian looks at you with admiration. He anticipates your every wish and showering you with gifts. But you good and honest girls don't need much. You're easily fooled." "But what do you think it would profit Grace to marry me?" Vivian put her hand on Ben's shoulder. A friendly, soothing gesture. "Money. a marriage of convenience. But that's silly. He's a rich man. I'm the daughter of middle-class parents. So what's the catch? Are you sure he's that rich? Did you ask him for his real estate documents? Did you even look at his passport? Did you see his income statement? What are you talking about? No, of course not. I didn't ask him any of that. It's obvious. He lived in Italy, he drove around in fancy cars, and he paid for us everywhere. He gave me expensive gifts and even paid for our wedding. A modest dinner at a restaurant. You don't need a lot of money for that. And your presents aren't that fancy. Trixie told me all about it with delight. Of course he had her fooled. But bouquets of flowers, candy, even a dress. It's not like your rich man's that broke. Even a student can afford that. Is that really the point? Vivian was getting angry. Why are you even picking on him? I'm sorry, Ben suddenly softened. It's just that I'm very, very afraid for you. You know, worried. Don't be. I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be great. I hope so. The conversation with Ben had thrown Vivian off balance. Until that dialogue, she'd thought she was doing the right thing. But her childhood friend had touched a note of doubt in her soul. Vivian herself was tormented by a vague premonition, something elusive. Grace behaved impeccably, still looked at the bride with admiration, still tried to please her in everything. He also showered her with compliments and spoke of their wonderful future together. But sometimes there was something in his gaze. Either discontent or contempt. The girl wrote it off as homesickness and concern about the affairs left so long in Italy. Probably Grace was worried about how things were going without him there. But nothing. Soon they will fly to Italy and live happily ever after. Just like in a fairy tale. It's a little scary, of course. Another country, another mentality. Everything is completely different. No friends around, no relatives. Ben's right about that. On the other hand, they will all come to visit her, and Vivian will gladly introduce them to a wonderful sunny country. Beautiful streets, gentle sea, smiling passers-by. Not at all like the streets of their hometown. Most importantly, she and Grace will be together. The feelings between them are so sincere and strong. Together they could handle anything. If Vivian had any doubts after her conversation with Ben, Grace, who greeted her with a wide smile and a warm embrace, immediately remedied the situation. He loves her. They will be happy together. That night, Vivian couldn't sleep. Grace was sitting in the other room, typing a message to someone on his laptop. It was a routine thing to read business emails, send replies. Big business requires constant involvement, the guy often repeated the phrase. Vivian liked that Grace seemed so easygoing, cheerful, and even a little joking. But at the same time, when it came to business, he was collected, responsible, serious. You couldn't go wrong with him. Grace, of course, is good in himself, with such a nice heaven and a coven. But Vivian wouldn't be living in a crib, more like a palace. A rich, handsome Italian is in love with her, and is ready to do anything for her. Vivian could not imagine such a thing even in her wildest fantasies. No, the girl always knew what young people like. This was evidenced by the numerous compliments and the corresponding looks of guys. Vivian, back in school, was often called for dates, and at the graduation she was constantly invited to dance. The girl was even tired and wanted to sit a little and take a break, only afraid to offend the cavaliers. But still, Grace is so handsome, so rich, and so smart. He needs a girl to match him. A Hollywood actress or a top model, no less. And he chose her, a simple girl. Pretty sure, but not a star or the daughter of wealthy parents. It's weird. Too much like a fairy tale. Trixie was jealous in a good way, and even asked Vivian to look around to see if there was a suitable suitor. Why? It would be wonderful to have a childhood friend suddenly at her side. Of course, Vivian would try to introduce Trixie to someone. Grace, it turns out, has a lot of brothers, even if they're not siblings. He's an only child himself. Trixie's cute, even though she's self-conscious about her supposed fullness. Isn't she a bride? And what wonderful photos Vivian will take in Italy. She already has a page on the internet where she posts her work and praises it. Even asks to sell some pictures. They are really beautiful. Vivian knows how to notice interesting and unusual things. But Italy is a completely different nature in architecture. Exotic, colorful. Vivian already anticipated the future excitement on her page. She will definitely familiarize her compatriots with this unique country through photos. Let them admire it too. Maybe she will even realize her dream. As the wife of a wealthy man, Vivian will probably be able not to work. Why should she? If Grace is going to provide for her family, and what would she do? Her degree in economics is unlikely to be valid in a foreign country. Different laws, different accounting rules. But the girl will be able to do her favorite thing. She'll take pictures. Who knows, maybe in the future it will bring her not only pleasure, but also money. And if not, it's okay. Now you don't have to worry about finances. Grace is incredibly rich. It's a very nice addition to the man you love. And then the phone rang. Grace. Someone was on the video conference. Vivian was all ears. No, she wasn't the type to eavesdrop on conversations out of curiosity. She just wanted to check herself to see how far she'd gotten in her Italian. Matthew, one of Grace's cousins, was on the line. First, the boys greeted each other, exchanged news, and in this short dialogue, to her satisfaction, Vivian understood every word clearly. But then the conversation took a strange turn. The girl understood everything, but she forgot to think about her success in Italian. The content of the dialogue was too suspicious and disturbing. "Well, are you going to get the money soon?" Matthew questioned. "And you think this kind of thing is quick?" Grace's voice sounded annoyed. "The wedding, the moving. Then there's still time to get it ready. So why don't we start preparing now? What's the holdup?" "No, you can't scare her off. You don't know anything about these things." Vivian froze on her bed. What was that now? Was it really about her? What should she be prepared for? What would scare her off? Somehow this all sounded very unpleasant. And then I remembered what Ben had said about Grace being slippery. He did seem that way now. "Are you sure your plan will work?" Matthew clarified with a clear threat in his voice. "I'm sure it's almost done. Just the finishing touches are left." "Well, watch this, or you know you're in debt. And if you can't pay it back in money, we'll take it another way." "It won't come to that." Grace tried to speak in a steady voice, but it was clear that he was in anxiety. With that, the brothers said their goodbyes and Grace went on with his letters. And Vivian? Of course she could not sleep now and kept going over the details of the strange conversation. And she liked that conversation less and less. This Matthew, whom Grace called brother. He'd spoken to Vivian's fiancé in a dismissive manner, not unlike a cousin and business partner. Matthew was threatening Grace, and the latter was talking about some plans, money, and debts. Vivian's first impulse was to approach her fiancé and ask him directly about everything, but the girl held back. That was not the way to do it. If Grace is really deceiving her, he will come up with something convincing this time. If the groom was honest, Vivian's suspicions might offend him. It's not nice to know your significant other doesn't trust you. No, that's not what Vivian will do. Now she will simply become more attentive, will listen, look closely, notice some important details. Eventually, the girl will find out the truth. For the next few days, nothing unusual happened. Grace was as charming as ever. Vivian even relaxed a little, forgot about the accidentally overheard conversation. The groom had a hypnotic effect on her. His gaze, his warm embrace, and his words that seemed to be able to pacify, to make her feel happy. With no one else had Vivian experienced such feelings. Vivian had not experienced such feelings before. And yet, when Grace once again called her mother from Italy via video call, Vivian turned to listen. She was in the kitchen at the time, Grace in the living room. The girl was washing dishes. The water was running noisily in the room. That was probably why Grace was convinced that the bride had not heard the bell. But Vivian, after her fiancé's strange conversation, did not blame herself for her excessive curiosity. The girl went to the door of the parlor and listened. She needed to know everything, absolutely everything about the man with whom she was going to tie her fate. Grace seemed to be hiding something. Perhaps his conversation with his mother would resolve this doubt. Vivian already realized that her fiancé was not as sincere and honest as he tried to seem, but she was not ready to hear such a thing. Grace's conversation with her mother turned out to be quite frank. He opened the girl's eyes to the situation in which she found herself. "Hello, son," the woman said affably, looking up from the screen at her son. "Hi, Miss You and little Lulu." Vivian smiled. She knew that Italians had a very strong attachment to their mothers. and thought that was a rather lovely fact. Here now, the grown-up Grace had unashamedly confessed to his mother that he missed her and his little sister. "I wish you'd come back already. So is the wedding coming up soon?" "In a week. It's not much longer. Then we'll go straight home. We'll almost have to pack." "Does she know yet?" "No, it's too early to tell her. When we get to Italy, her relatives and acquaintances won't be around. It's a very different situation. I shall have much more influence over her there." Vivian froze. There she was again. They're talking of some dangerous plans for her, intrigues. What was going on at all? Vivian suddenly realized she didn't want to go to Italy, and Grace could hardly be trusted. "You're so smart," the woman on the other side of the screen said with pride in her voice. "Your father was the same way, but you're even smarter. You've had a lot of wisdom since you were a child. Does this poor girl really believe that you are in love with her? You're so handsome and she thinks you're rich." "Poor thing" is the most hurtful expression for Vivian's blonde, this woman, future mother-in-law. She smiled so affectionately in her face and called her beautiful, while she herself is like an evil stepmother from a typical fairy tale. "You know I know how to be gallant when necessary. We will take into account," she said. She just lost her head over me. And it's so easy. A very simple task. She's as naive as a child. Well, all the better. "You bet. Back in Italy, when I took her and that friend of hers for a ride in the rental car, I negligently forgot to remove the rental tag from the passenger seat. And she didn't notice. She believed I owned an expensive sports car. She was so surprised. You should have seen her at that moment." "There's nothing to be surprised about. She doesn't understand Italian, so she didn't realize it. By the way, are you sure your fiancé doesn't know the language?" "They don't. She can only translate a few words of Italian, that's all. She's not very bright at all. Lucky for us. Maybe we shouldn't be so frank in front of her." "Don't worry. First of all, we're talking fast, so she won't get the point. And second of all, she's in the kitchen right now doing the dishes. The water's running. That fool doesn't even know I'm talking to you." "That's good, my boy, because I have a lot of questions for you." "What kind of questions?" "I think we've talked about this a bunch of times. But let's go over the basics again. How are you going to tell the girl that you're going to live in a tiny apartment in Rome instead of going to our non-existent estate with huge vineyards? That's nonsense. I'll say that I have business in the capital and will stay in my studio apartment here for the time being. I've already rented it for a few weeks. Oh, it's costing me a lot of money. At first I let the dust in my eyes, rented cars, took them to clubs in Italy, gave them gifts. Now I live in her apartment. I save money, like a hotel, but I have to buy groceries and cook dinners for her to maintain influence on her. Now I've got this rented apartment in Rome. It's okay. If it works out, you'll cover all your expenses and pay off some of your debts," Grace said. "Yeah, the most urgent debts have to be paid off soon. Ultimo is harassing me, threatening me. He doesn't want to wait any longer." "I told you not to mess with him," the woman said with concern in her voice. "I thought I'd make good money with him. But that's how it turned out. Now I got to make it work. First of all, you'll pay off the motel debt, and then you'll take care of the bank loans. See if we can get out of this debt hole of ours." "I'm sorry I can't help you." "Come on, Mom, you're always so supportive, aren't you?" Vivian stood at the door. She'd already realized that Grace had lied to her. Lied to her from the start. He wasn't a businessman, he was in debt. And Ben wasn't his cousin at all. Grace owed money to dangerous people. He's been pushed to the wall, and the charming Italian is desperately looking for a way out. The fancy cars aren't his. They were rented. The apartment where the newlyweds planned to go after the wedding was also rented, although Grace claimed he'd recently bought it with money he'd earned. Vivian had noticed the pride and fire in his eyes. It was horribly disgusting. Disgusting. It's also frightening, disturbing. It was not clear what part she, Vivian, played in this scheme. What was she to do with it? Mother and son continued their conversation in full confidence that no one would hear them, and if they did, they would not understand. "Your fiancée, doesn't she know anything?" Grace asked. "No, why should she?" She grinned. She's in love with me, like Juliet with Romeo. She looks at me with loving eyes and agrees with every word I say. So it won't be hard to convince her to sell the apartment, especially once we're in Italy, away from her family. Then I'll give the money to Ben, and Ultimo will finally be off my back. Vivian felt as if she'd been hit over the head with a bag. That's it. Turns out Grace was in on the whole thing because of her real estate. Yeah, her parents bought her an expensive apartment in an upscale neighborhood. You can get a lot of money for that. And she needs the money, Grace. That's what her plan is. A young, charming con artist has run up debts. She's being threatened. She needs to pay the money back fast. So the bastard comes up with a brilliant plan. Except it's not going to work. What luck that Vivian once decided to go to these language courses. A chill suddenly ran down her spine. She was scared. She is alone with a person who is probably a criminal. At the very least, she definitely had some dealings with Ben, and the latter is a real criminal by the looks of it. Grace is a scary person. I don't know what she's capable of. And Vivian is alone here, all alone. She took her cell phone out of her sweatshirt pocket and, without leaving her observation post, began to write messages. To whom? She texted Eden, of course, out of habit. He was always there for her in difficult situations. And now, his presence and support would be of great help now. Vivian did not leave the door of the parlor. The conversation was not yet over. What if she found out something else interesting? She did. Grace and her son went on to discuss how they'd gotten to Vivian in the first place. It turned out that the criminal couple made their money by seducing rich female tourists of all ages, staying in their rooms overnight, and then disappearing in the morning with jewelry and cash. As a rule, the women were embarrassed to go to the police. Of course, who would want to admit they'd been duped? A young swindler charmed you, complimented you, then cleaned you out and ran away. Ladies in that situation don't look so good, to put it bluntly. Yeah, even if the victims had gone to the authorities, Grace was virtually impossible to find. He chose a different part of town each time. Each time, he'd change his appearance a little bit and use an assumed name. And of course, the guy would find out where the cameras were in the hotel beforehand and try to stay out of sight. It was a win-win. Except it didn't make much money. Grace had debts, lots of debts. First, bank loans. The guy loved the high life, vacations, expensive cars, brand name clothes. He shamelessly took loans, which then, of course, had nothing to repay, because Grace did not work. He had no education, no desire to work for anyone. That's why Grace got involved with Ben one day. It seemed to the guy that it was a great opportunity to easily and quickly earn a decent sum. But something went wrong. Grace ended up owing dangerous people. They kept calling him, threatening him. The debt increased every day, which drove Grace to despair. He realized that if he couldn't find the money, he might not be spared. Vivian learned all this while standing in front of her own living room door. And then Grace's mother, who was well aware of her son's means of earning money, proposed a wonderful plan to her offspring. And from the conversation between son and mother, Vivian realized that the woman has great power over the guy. He is ready to do anything to please her. The lady didn't work. She kind of took care of the house and her young daughter. They were occasionally kept together by a man, another suitor for Grace's spectacular mother. But these were unstable sources of income that quickly dried up. The main earner remained Grace with his petty scams against rich tourists. It was the mother who encouraged the handsome son to make money this way. Realizing what was going on, Vivian felt something like pity for Grace for a while. It's a terrible thing to be used like that by your own mother. Vivian's unfulfilled mother-in-law decided that in the current situation, the cash and jewelry of rich ladies would not be enough to cover her debts. So she came up with a new, much more risky and complicated way of making money. If it worked out, Grace would have the money to pay off Ben. Grace's mother targeted Vivian herself. She found out through her channels that there were 2 young Russian tourists staying at the hotel and ran a background check on them. Of course, not only Vivian was in the field of vision of the clever ladies, but she turned out to be the most suitable candidate for several reasons. The first and most important, the presence of her own living space, an apartment in the center of her hometown, registered on the girl. Yes, Grace's mother had access to that information. I had to pay a small sum for the database, but the benefit of owning valuable information many times exceeded the cost of the purchase. Secondly, Vivian herself was the perfect victim. Young, inexperienced, gullible. First Grace's mother, and then he himself had watched the girl for days before acting. Hearing this, Vivian shuddered. She was being watched. She was so happy and enthusiastic she didn't even notice anything. Vivian was lucky that mother and son decided to discuss this whole story in great detail and talked about plans and even remembered the past. Now the girl was aware of everything. Further, the conversation between Grace and his mother turned to everyday topics. The weather, the health of some common relatives, the mischief of the groom's little sister Vivian. They made no further mention of their victim, but Vivian already knew all she needed to know. The girl returned to the kitchen and sank powerlessly into a padded chair. Her rose-colored glasses had just shattered with a crash and clink, and as it always happens, with the glasses inward, she was in pain. Unbearably hurt that the beautiful fairy tale and unearthly love had all turned out to be just a deception. And Grace wasn't the perfect prince on a white horse, but a con man. He has no feelings for Vivian, only pure calculation. According to Grace and his mother's plan, Vivian was to be the wife of the con man. Together they would go to another country, live in a rented apartment, which Vivian would consider Grace's property for the time being. Then the young husband would ask her to sell the apartment, and Vivian would agree. Of course she would. Grace would surely think of some plausible excuse. He'd been working her over so skillfully all this time that there was no doubt Vivian would sell the apartment and give him the money. And then the divorce. And Vivian would be alone in a foreign country with no money and no support. Of course, her parents would not abandon her in a difficult situation, would send money for a ticket, and the girl would return to her native country, where she would no longer have her own apartment. Even to imagine such an outcome is scary. In Grace, he would have gotten away with it, because legally he did nothing wrong. Vivian would have sold the apartment herself and handled the money herself, giving it to her spouse as she saw fit. There is no crime. It doesn't seem to exist in this situation. What kind of cunning plan? But Vivian did figure it out. She decided to wait until Ben arrived, to whom she'd written a couple of messages. Until then, she would do nothing. Who knew how Grace would behave when she realized that his plan had failed? I mean, this was a long-term project for the con man. The guy invested a lot of time, effort, and money to impress Vivian and create the image of a rich groom. The con man had to go to a lot of expense. Oh, he's going to be pissed. It would be better if Vivian wasn't alone at the moment of exposure. But the girl did not hold back. After speaking to her mother, Grace entered the kitchen with a fond smile on her lips. Now she seemed to Vivian unpleasant and insincere. But only half an hour ago she had been admiring the dimples on her lover's cheeks, which appear when he smiles, admiring and feeling happy and loved. "Shall I help you, my love?" Grace asked, pushing Vivian away from the sink where she was washing plates. "I'm getting used to the royal life. In my house you won't be doing kitchen duties, dishes, washing, or laundry." Here Vivian couldn't take it anymore. Restrained anger, despair, and frustration burst forth in a mighty torrent. "Of course I won't be a maid in your house," exclaimed the girl. "I shall never be in your house at all, because you have no house at all." Grace, perhaps for the first time since the day of their acquaintance, looked confused. The boy flapped his long eyelashes and shook his head. "I know everything," Vivian repeated calmly, looking into Grace's eyes. She was triumphant at this moment. He thought she was a naive simpleton, an easy victim, trying to take advantage of the inexperience of a girl in love. Well, you got the wrong girl. Vivian isn't that simple. "How did you know that?" Grace seemed to realize there was no point in denying it. "You spoke too frankly to your mother," in the purest Italian Vivian blurted out. Grace's eyes widened in surprise. Yes, as the girl had once planned, she had impressed him with her knowledge of Italian, just not in the situation in which it was supposed to happen. Grace was angry. The girl noticed it at once. A bad glint appeared in his eyes. His hands clenched into fists so white his knuckles turned white. Vivian tensed. She was afraid. She suddenly realized that she had been wrong to snap, wrong to change her decision to hold on until Ben arrived. But Vivian didn't show her fear. "Get out of my apartment," she sternly ordered her estranged husband. "Right now I'll pack your things and leave them on the doorstep, and then leave immediately, or I'll call the police." "I will," Grace whispered, slowly approaching Vivian. She instinctively retreated to the windowsill. Like a frightened bird, she wondered what he could do to her in her condition. He was obviously up to something evil. "I'll leave, but I'll pay my expenses first. The money I spent on you. That's fair, isn't it? Give me your jewelry, your money. Your money. What else you got? I'll leave." That's how Grace's veneer of sincerity and benevolence came off. Now Vivian was faced with a greedy and unpleasant man, a fraud, a cheat, a deceiver who might even be capable of physically harming her. How frightful. "I don't have any jewelry," she whispered. Her fervor had worn off. Now she felt only horror in the face of the all-consuming danger that would rob her of her will and paralyze her. Grace rushed into the rooms, smashing and breaking everything in his path. Vivian could hear him slamming closet doors, searching for something to sell. The boy was desperate. In such a state, a man, especially a man like Grace, could do anything. Vivian tried to leave the apartment, but Grace pushed her away from the door and shouted at her so much that she immediately realized that the next time she went out like that could have serious consequences. Vivian sat in the kitchen with her arms around her head, listening to Grace ransacking her apartment. And then Ben showed up. Vivian had always been excited to see her friend. But now it was something special. The girl felt like a mountain had been lifted off her shoulders. Ben quickly assessed the situation. When he noticed Vivian huddled in the corner of the kitchen, he became furious. Cussing and fighting sounds came to the girl's ears. "Get out of here." Ben literally threw Grace out of the apartment and then dialed the police. He spoke loudly and clearly so that Grace, who kept banging on the closed door, could make out every word. Then Ben rushed to Vivian, put his arms around her. The girl clung to him. She was shivering. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. So many events, so many emotions. Ben stroked her back, her hair, her shoulders, said something soothing and affectionate, nodding his words, not asking unnecessary questions. Realized that the girl was in the wrong state of mind right now. A few months passed. Grace returned to Italy. The police did not start a case of a con man on him. Lucky him. On his hand played the fact that he and Vivian had time to apply to the registry office, that is, considered a bride and groom. So the guy wasn't prosecuted for breaking into someone else's home. After all, the landlady was not a stranger to him. The whole situation looked like a personal quarrel, a misunderstanding between spouses. A domestic dispute. And Vivian had no proof that Grace was a con man and a con artist. The Italian left America a pauper. Vivian didn't know how he'd gotten over his failure. She didn't really care, by and large. Vivian posted her story on every travel forum she could find. She detailed how she had fallen for the scammer and even posted pictures of Grace. Perhaps it would help at least someone to avoid meeting the scoundrel. Vivian was not long worried, thwarted wedding. For it wasn't long before she received another proposal. This time from Ben. Then, that terrible evening, sitting on the kitchen floor, the young people frankly talked. It turned out that Ben had been in love with Vivian since childhood and therefore was very jealous of her overseas fiancé. And then when he met Grace in person, he was the only one of the company who was not affected by the foreigner's charms. "I mean, you were in love with me?" Vivian stared at the boy. The surprise that followed this confession, for the time being, even overshadowed the emotion of Grace's disclosure. "I was your secret admirer, and you thought of me only as a girlfriend." "You've said that many times yourself," Ben smiled. "All I had to do was watch your many affairs from the sidelines and wish desperately that I could be one of those guys someday." "What fools we were," Vivian laughed. "Thanks to that Grace of yours. He really is an angel, isn't he? It's thanks to him that we've finally gotten it all straightened out. I've had a crush on you since first grade. But I didn't think I'd be attracted to you as a guy. That's why I became your friend. So I could at least be there for you, keep you safe." Anyway, Vivian was getting ready to get married again, only with a completely different man. This time she had no doubts or worries. Everything was going right now. The son kicked out the village mother in a snowstorm. A year later, when he came to visit her, Emily lovingly stroked the smooth side of the glass cylinder with pickles, leaned over it, inhaled the pleasant aroma of fresh dill, garlic, cherry leaves, which she was sure to add to her preparations. Now she would close the next batch with metal lids, roll it up, put it to cool, and then take it to the cellar to the shelves. She thought for the 100th time that this year there was a good harvest of vegetables in the vegetable garden, and she herself would not go hungry in the winter. And she had prepared supplies for her son Archie in the city. Behind her back, in the corner of the summer kitchen, there was a faint sound and some inarticulate mumbling. It was her mother Helen awake, peacefully dozing, whispers, smells, the gurgling of pickles on the stove. A sturdy couch with a pile of old blankets and pillows had been there since ancient times. Now she had dragged Ellen there on her own to keep the old woman in sight. Although she was not quite ancient, only a little over 70 years old, she had not been on her feet for 5 years. The doctors then only waved their hands. We do not observe any physical abnormalities, no stroke or other symptoms that could give an order to the legs not to walk. There is no history of any. And they keep their lower limbs on their own. Your mother's more frail body refuses to fulfill its physiological purpose. Grandmother Helene is a well-known personality in the village. Back in the days when the Soviet kolkhoz ruled everything in the village, not a single matter of importance could be done without her ubiquitous nose. A small woman, just like Thumbelina, in appearance and in character. She could run the farm. Nobody drove the cows to the field for haying better than her. The men could never keep up with her. When she digs potatoes in her vegetable garden, people marvel. They are still checking where to put the tubers for drying. Ellen already has dry and even potatoes in bags, waiting for their hour. Lubia even called her our eternal engine. Where did they dig up such a term in those times? Peasants can't keep up with science. Someone from the visiting business travelers dropped this nickname. After the perky little girl, everyone picked it up at once. The village perpetual motion machine could not cope with the loads overnight. It fell out of working order, as if the battery inside had run out of charge. Emily herself was a tall and statuesque woman. Not a particularly fit woman, but she wasn't exactly overweight. She was all juicy, appetizing, tall, with huge blue eyes of all shades of cornflower, and a kerchief always tied around her, covering a mop of light, thick hair. Spoiled Max in the army and clothes. In the old days they would say, "Here she is, a real American beauty." But Emily didn't care for these compliments. She would pick up her mother, light as a fluff ball, and drag her into the cradle of an old motorcycle. She handled that mechanical inheritance of her father's. Her father has long gone to the other world, but managed to accustom his daughter to friendship with the iron helper. In the countryside, motorcycle a godsend, something to transport small things, to the store to run to get provisions, 1 centner of sugar for jams and compotes, and to buy on wheels a nice thing, to solve all sorts of problems. So now the street did not keep my mother in the 4 walls of the house. To the river to refresh in the cool water, while Mom on a blanket in the shade of willow will sit. Together they went to a distant berry plot with strawberries, red and black currants. Also in the company of Ellen. Emily wanders along the rows with a bow, Mom near the motorcycle on a blanket buckets with the harvest guarding. There, both women are not in grief alone. They have their own blood a point at their side. It's good to be alive. Infirm Matthew didn't see his beloved husband. He would have been sad. He burned to death 6 years ago from a simple flu. His immune system had already weakened with age, and the disease had a dead grip on him. He was almost 20 years older than his wife, and still remembered how their collective farm had been raised from the ruins after World War II, how they had plowed and sown almost by hand, without machinery. Matvey first saw the eyes of his young wife Helen among the cows. The sometimes capricious milk suppliers obeyed this impudent girl unconditionally. The man then thought that it seemed that the young lady was afraid of her soul and diligently gave her everything that had gathered in their uterus. There was no time for dating and courtship in that hard time. At the evening in the village club, Matthew spoke to the locals as a specialist sent from a neighboring, more prosperous region to help. He called for victorious labor, inspired to exploits. After his speech, the girl herself came up to him and extended a small, strong palm. "You said everything right, comrade. Who, if not us, will raise the farm to new heights? Let's get acquainted. I'm Ellen. If you need help, please contact me." By the way, 40-year-old Matthew was very handsome and smiling, had that very male charm which the female sex will never pass indifferently. All the widows in the village were already looking at him with interest, but he did not notice anyone and nothing around him. As he came out of the club with Helen to walk her home and discuss the affairs of the collective farm, he fell in love definitively and irrevocably. His feelings were mutual. His soul was not embarrassed neither by the difference in age, nor by the sarcastic sneers of his comrades. The little girl chose an old man as her soulmate. A small gold mine, but a dear one. To the visiting father turned out to be, "Look, turrets, and the girl is spinning our collective farm leader." Matthew and Ellen got married right after the end of harvesting. The traveling specialist had no place of his own. Ellen's parents did not say a word against their love. He came to the Primakovs in a small house of his wife's parents and lived there for the rest of his life. Together parents, and in time spent the last journey. Next to the woman he loved, everything seems easier and simpler. After 3 years of marriage, they had Emily. I wish her parents had a brother or sister later. Yes, Ellen's doctors didn't advise her to take any more risks. There were delegations from the maternity hospital to the pediatric ward. The baby was born a girl giant, almost 60 centimeters of height and 5 kilograms of weight. The doctors were saying, "We have you, mommy, a total female anomaly. Such tiny babies do not give birth to such large babies. We could send your information to the Guinness Book of Records." Matthew and Ellen only smiled, so our father is 2 meters tall, a slouch in the shoulders. We have someone to give our daughter a big birth. Subsequently, no giant Emily was not marked. She grew and developed like all other peers. Beauty in her father, energy in her mother. It was a strange combination. Now she was approaching 50 years of age. And the fact that I was endowed with beauty from my parents and God, I never recognized it. She always walked past mirrors in passing, not looking into them unnecessarily, at dances and festivals in the shadow of other village beauties. One joy in the world's son Arson, who lives in the regional center. Now she will deal with cucumbers, zucchini and cherry jam. Mom, thank God, with a bright mind and good memory, word and advice will always support. She would come and stroke her head, stare into her eyes with her clear gaze. I thought to myself that the fact that her mother's legs had failed was pain, hopelessness. That the hour of her husband Matthew came to the graveyard to come to terms. A woman in love with this loss could not. Her legs refused. But grooms on the now empty land for her without her beloved by her side to tread. Emily picked up her mother with a familiar motion, pulling her by the arm. "Now I'll take you, my good one. We'll have tea afterward. I got your favorite cookies from the store." Helene put her arms around her daughter's neck, pressed her cheek against her warm shoulder. "My poor girl. Why did you have such a heavy cross of struggle and loneliness in this life, forever giving your heart to one single man? Why have you suffered such anguish of womanly longing?" Images from 30 years ago swam before Emily's eyes. In the late 80s, the Soviet Union was like a colossus on legs of clay. Dusty, hot rural summers, the kolkhoz, which had given a lot of resources, could barely cope with the tasks. People fled to the city. Physical labor in the field was no longer the pride of the toilers. After the death of the communist leader, the country changed several rulers. The last one declared glasnost in the fight against drunkenness. It became unclear how to go on living. The collective farm managed to harvest watermelons and melons. A student group was sent from the city. They settled them in a school. No money was promised. The collective farm was impoverished, but they promised to feed them in the club so that the young people would not get bored. In the evenings, they played movies and organized discos. Emily had just finished school. She caught a cold when the students went swimming in the river. When it was time to apply for university, she dreamed of becoming a biologist. But the girl came down with a fever over 40. They wanted to put her in the hospital, but Ellen said that she would cure her daughter herself. At the family council, it was decided that she should not go to the army, but work in the village for a year, and the next year to enroll. A suitable vacancy was found: quickly assistant cook in the student canteen. 2 women did not have time to serve 50 people 3 times a day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The townspeople were squeamish about rubbing the utensils with napkins, asking to wash the dishes again. They were in desperate need of a nimble and savvy helper. Here's my revision of the text, following your instructions. Emily recovered from her illness a week after the students arrived in the village. She had not yet met any of them. When Ellen's friend complained that she and her partner had been knocked off their feet in the dining hall, Ellen remarked gravely, "I'll be of more use in the fields and on the ruins of our once prosperous farm. And let Emily go and help. You needn't let her sit at home all summer. She's quite well now." The work in the canteen was marked by a bright, extraordinary event. The girl at the new workplace on the first day went with a tray full of glasses with compote. Before lunch, yes on a small puddle at the table slipped. Set on a tray of fragile dishes flew to the floor, as in slow motion. A few seconds later, a bright maroon stain blurred, dotted with small glasses. Emily rushed to collect them in her apron, so that the students already at the tables wouldn't cut themselves. The treacherous piece of glass entered her hand so quickly that she didn't even feel the pain at first. Just above her palm, a purple stain began to blur. Droplets that looked like red rowan berries dripped onto the floor. Emily felt dizzy. The crowd gathered around her was shrugged off by some guy. Get out of the way. My dad's a surgeon. I know how to provide expert care for wounds this deep. Get the first aid kit. What's a first aid kit in a village canteen? A bottle of iodine, an empty bandage packet, small narrow tubes of plaster rolled up like a roll, analgin tablets, that was all the medical stock. Seeing that the first aid kit would not help, the boy sharply pulled off his light-colored cotton shirt and tore it into a bandage. Carefully took out the glass that had caught the end in the girl's arm, treated the wound with iodine, and wrapped a cloth around it. That's it. You'll get to the local paramedic in peace now, and I'll walk you there. Let's get acquainted, shall we? My name is Vincent. Emily looked up at her healer. Tall, slender. The face of an intelligent city boy with gray, intelligent, age-inappropriate eyes. He looks at her directly, openly, with a smile. Vincent is already holding out his hand to walk together to the village nurse's station. He's even going to skip lunch for the occasion. He'll be hungry for the rest of the evening because of her. Some fellow was already holding out to Vincent the plaid shirt he was wearing over his t-shirt. The unwilling doctor deftly pulled it over his strong torso and smiled at the student. I'll have your closet back to you in an hour. Thanks, friend, helped out. I don't care. I have to change, Emily told her savior. She thought to herself, he's nothing like our local guys. Clean, neat, polite. Not like Greg and her high school boyfriend. Shirt always open, dirty pants, all stained, cigarette in the corner of his thin, predatory lips. What kind of a groom is he? In vain they were already matched with each other in the village. No offense, but my favorite Max refused my offer to dine with me, Vincent said. I'll hand you over to your village doctor. Then we'll go. That's a fine word. Aesculapius, Emily thought at a loss. One must keep one's ear to the ground with these city folk. Always they have words abstruse, quotations from books, and she had never held other printed editions in her hands, except for fiction from the school curriculum and a large colorful book in the world of fauna and flora. After that book, and she had a dream to become a biologist and study the animal world. But for the time being, these bright prospects were pushed away from her for a whole year because of the unfortunate bronchitis. They walked in silence to the nurse's station. Vincent didn't ask her any questions, seeing that she occasionally wrinkled her nose in pain. The paramedic in the office praised the man who'd been next to the injured waitress. Look how skillfully the wound is treated. Who was able to do it so clearly? I did the best I could, without false modesty, Vincent announced. I come from a family of hereditary surgeons. My father, mother, grandfather, it's as if they were all born with a scalpel in their hands. It would be foolish for me not to have basic first aid skills. After handing Emily over to the medical officer as promised, the boy bowed courteously and disappeared out the door. Emily could only look at him with annoyance and conclude that such a man would not make a long acquaintance with a village girl. Not to her liking, even if his eyes were as blue as lakes. Too refined, urban. A prince from a fairy tale read to them as a child by a kindergarten teacher. He wouldn't follow his princess to the dining room door in a carriage. Emily was wrong. The next day, the first person she saw outside the dining room was Vincent. He greeted her again with his impossibly warm smile and said, I have the day off after 3 shifts at Bachton. Why don't I help you set the tables? Your arm's in bandages. It's early. I don't think it stopped hurting. We can do it better together. Then we'll go to the movies. They're showing an old comedy at the club today. Ivan Vasilievich changes profession. Have you seen that movie before? Emily's feet had been knocked off the ground. She's not the one being greeted by a real knight in the cafeteria. She's not the one called to the movies after work, or offered to help with trays, forks, and spoons. It couldn't be, because it could never be. But it was happening in real life. Vincent didn't seem at all intent on hiding his obvious interest in her. Emily banished the memories that had come flooding back to her after fiddling with the string of pickle jars. She sat Ellen down at the table in a soft blanket, so that she could finally end the day with some aromatic herbal tea. Summer was soon rolling smoothly into its second half. Time fled, not as it had in her youth, stretching like sweet molasses. Annoyed, Ellen asked to go to bed after tea. It was time for her to go to bed herself. She had grand plans for this summer's warmth and pickles, so long as there were no problems. She'd pack up some presents for New Year's Eve in the fall. It was unlikely that she would be able to get out to the city before then. The last thoughts of the woman had already sunk into a blissful sleep. Tomorrow is a new day and new worries. Emily was a good hostess. What she could not cook from the gifts of the vegetable garden and the garden. It was her and Mama Ellen's house that was old and dilapidated, and everything that grew on the ground and in the ground always succeeded to the glory. Having finished the epic with cucumbers, she switched to caviar from zucchini or juice, which she cooked from all the fruits ripening on the trees. It was her turn to put the tomatoes in jars. Then to cut apricots, apples, plums, and pears into large slices and send them to sunbathe on metal sheets under the sun. My son has always respected dried fruit compote. He could make it himself at home in the city. It was a simple matter. Emily looked down at the sacks of potatoes, at the makeshift nets made of old stockings and stuffed with golden onions, and sighed. Though she still seemed to have the strength to carry all this wealth into town herself. Would she have to go to Greg again? He'll start his chatter. I've been waiting 30 years for you to marry me. I'll give up the gorilla and the vodka. You know me. She'll smoke all the way to the cabin. I can't breathe. Yeah, pelting her with salty jokes and lewd innuendos. He just won't let it go, the old dog. Long married, 3 grown-up children, grandchildren already. And he keeps looking questioningly into her eyes, as if he wants to read something in them. Don't believe that first high school love never rusts. Since she was young, Greg had been her eternal sighing partner. But he never got anything. One thing's for sure, if she asks him to drive his truck to Archie's, he'll never say no. By the morning of December 25th, a blizzard was brewing. Emily had already arranged with her neighbor Maggie to look after 2 or 3 bags for Archie. Emily had packed such bulky bags that faithful Greg only shouted when he saw them on the doorstep. Be thankful my heart is heavy for you. No fool would have agreed to haul all that stuff into town on our dirt road to the highway. Only my iron horse can do it with 4-wheel drive and off-road capabilities. Would you haul your bags to the bag on a motorcycle? Emily. I wouldn't be so nice to you. Emily hurriedly slipped him a pre-prepared bottle of her famous Naluka made from all the seasonal fruits and berries. The secret of this strong elixir was simple. Whatever fruit or berry was ripe, they were poured in a layer on the bottom of a 10-liter container up to half, covered with sugar, then the next layer of ripe fruit, and so on until the last autumn harvest of frost-resistant berries. We let it insist for 21 days, picked, separating from the rest of the fruit and berries, and then topped up with vodka from the village store, for residual disinfection. The result was a drink of unprecedented flavor. The whole village was waiting for Emily and Ellen to treat them to this gift. Greg pushed the bag of money away. He grabbed Emily's hand. There is no such gift. I have been waiting for so many years from you, my grandmother. You are alone. A century. You are not a stone, Emily, nor ice. I can't believe you're still faithful to your first love. It doesn't work like that. Emily shoved Greg away in her heart and gritted her teeth. You can be the only man on this planet. I'll never be yours. You hear me, Greg? You don't know what it's like. All your life one man remember to love, Greg asked. How many times have you and I already brought up this subject? I consider you a friend, not by way of a hitchhiker, a heavy drinker, but not evil. But why are you playing that song again? We shouldn't pick sweet berries together, but bitter berries. I cut everything off without you a long time ago. Even the idea of starting the car. It's going to snow soon. And you still have to get back to the village by daylight. The days are so short, it'll be dark before you know it. Archie was in high spirits this morning. The New Year's Eve party at his firm had been timed to coincide with Catholic Christmas. On this occasion, this Saturday was rented a nice cozy cafe near their office. Since some time ago, a new female employee from the marketing department has been actively making eyes at him. Tonight, he would invite her to his house after the party for a cup of coffee. Archie sighed dreamily and mentally assured himself, chicks like me. I change them like worn-out gloves that don't fit into the last closet. This young lady will not resist, he was sure of his complete male irresistibility. So look, and New Year's vacations he and this person will spend together. Someone has to make Olivier salad for the festive table, and finally to put in order in his bachelor's den. Pretty face and appetizing figure of the new girl will be an additional prize. He'd already broken up with his ex-girlfriend 2 weeks ago. It was time to find her a worthy replacement from those who are not puzzled by complexes. He won't be dragged to the registry office. The redhead from the neighboring department was definitely from this carefree cohort of girls. Winter celebrations promised a lot of pleasant surprises. Coming out of the shower in only a towel, Archie heard a knock at the door. He hurried to open it. "Mom, what are you doing here in town?" he wondered. "I wasn't expecting you. You're in the wrong place today." For some reason, Emily was immediately confused by the cold reception. She wanted to hug her son, she missed him. On the diplomat in her hands, but he squeamishly removed her hands. "You should warn me about your unexpected visits," Archie said. "I might have other plans for the near future. And now you're here. How did you manage to surprise me? What are you dragging across the threshold? Look at your wet footprints on the floor." The events that followed seemed like a bad dream to Emily for a long time afterward. Archie angrily kicked the sack of potatoes, pushed aside the bag of onions, lovingly packed by his mother in a plastic bag so that they wouldn't get wet. With annoyance, he settled down on a large bag with pickles. "How could you think, Mother, that I was starving here? There's a supermarket around the corner. The shelves are full of goods." "I tried to get you some things for the winter holidays," Emily said. "Archie's used to all his own, homemade, natural." "Don't be such a country bumpkin," Archie said angrily. "I've been a city dweller for a long time and I live by the rules of a big metropolis. I'm not going to waste time on your culinary riches. Pack all this stuff back up. And next time you'll give me a little more notice of your visit. I don't need a mother hen mooching over me like a little chicken. I think you have an old friend in town who's lonely. Go to her with all these presents. Make the old lady happy with a New Year's offering." The young man grabbed the grocery bags and started carrying them out to the entrance, without letting his mother enter the apartment, without at least offering to warm herself with tea. Emily couldn't believe this wasn't happening to her. Her son couldn't do this to her. What evil spells had this town put him under? The truck is probably already out of town and headed for home. She hadn't corresponded with her city friend in over a year. How to know if it was possible to visit her now, or would she also give her the runaround? The snowstorm was getting worse outside. The snow was falling not in large fluffy snowflakes, but in a sharp and chopping way. It was too early to reveal a face uncovered by clothes and headdresses. Archie, meanwhile, carried all his mother's presents out into the empty yard. The yard glistened in this weather, and darkness was slowly descending on Chicago, which liked to come early in the cold season. "I called a cab for you," Archie said. "I hope you remember your high school buddy's address clearly. I've wasted so much time with you. I've got to get cleaned up for the New Year's Eve party. You should know that. I'm going through some changes in my personal life. There's nothing for you to do here in Chicago anytime soon. I'll be fine on my own. I'm going to be 30 years old in April. I don't need your pesky tutelage anymore." A young guy came to the call, fussily began to put food supplies in the trunk, all the time looking back at the angry man, and for some reason the woman, who was writhing in pain, even thought to himself, there's something wrong between them. He is saying something to her. She looks pitifully and covers her face with her palm. But it's none of my business. I'll fulfill the order and go on my way. New Year's Eve and the vacations themselves, if you try for a couple of months. Then, until spring will feed me. Emily got into the car without looking back. It was so unbearably painful, as if something bright, always warming her soul, had been doused with viscous, stinking marsh mud. No bath gels and foams could wash it away. No bath gels and foams could drown out the vile odor of her soul's decay. She always bought in the store all these fragrant accessories for bathing, to pamper, to please Helene. The old woman was always delighted to smell them at home. But here, in this case, the vibes of the subtle odors were unable to remove that blackness. She only relaxed when she climbed into the back seat. The tears came in streams. There was no stopping their rapid flow. Though she didn't like to show weakness in public, she couldn't hold back. The driver asked her sympathetically, "Where are we going, lady?" The answer shocked him. "You can throw me out in a clear field," Emily said. "My son didn't even ask if I had the money to pay you for the job. Prices are different in the city. I don't have enough cash reserves for a long trip. You know," she suddenly became lively, "I can pay you back with village products. I have excellent potatoes, some onions, cylinders with cucumbers, and tomatoes from my own beds. Will that pay?" This cab driver had seen a lot of things in his 2 years in Chicago, but he had never read such hopeless sorrow in anyone's eyes. It's like she just gave up a living son. He was now taking this woman to nowhere. And it felt like she'd just buried him. It didn't take him long to make up his mind, but soon he said, "Why do we need your gifts, Ma? I am. Can't we find a plate of pilaf and a cup of hot tea for a good man?" "What if I'm bad?" Emily asked. "Come on, I'm not kidding. I have a good eye. I can always tell an honest and kind heart from a bad and deceitful one. I'm going to bring you back to my house. Don't be afraid of anything around me." Emily didn't have many highlights in her life, except a few trips with Archie to the sea and those happy times when they were so attached to each other. Once they arrived in sunny Miami, they both immediately fell in love with this southern land with azure sea, sand dunes, the cries of seagulls, daring dolphins swimming directly to the shore. Then, after high school, Archie graduated from a technical university in Chicago, and so there in the dormitory at first and stayed. He didn't make such a brilliant career, but his income was enough for his current expenses. Then I rented a cozy 2-room apartment almost in the center. He spent a lot of time in the company of student friends, and then colleagues. Emily soberly realized that a grown-up young man cannot keep near the mother's skirt. In her hometown in the last 2 or 3 years, he no longer visited. Emily didn't own any modern gadgets. All communication was through an old button cell phone. Archie called her no more than once or twice a month, reducing communication to brief questions and answers. And the connection in her backwoods town was stable, but in bad weather it failed. Their estrangement from each other was probably inevitable. But why did it hurt so much today then? Emily visited her son every year under the New Year's holiday with country guests. His current reaction had put her in a stupor. Or had something seriously changed in Archie's soul in this tough town? She hadn't noticed. Only questions were bouncing around in her head right now. And there were no answers. The silent cab driver drove her to the outskirts of Chicago to one of the houses that used to be solidly inhabited by tenants of communal apartments. She was not mistaken, one of those huge apartments with many doors opening into a hallway and an impressive kitchen. She and a young boy had entered. At first she was confused. Within the walls of this apartment lived a whole Tabor, which now spilled out of all the rooms to consider the unexpected guest. There was a speech she did not understand, but there was no aggression in its tone. The fellow cab driver stopped all debate in a flash. A couple minutes later, she was ushered into an empty room with a small sofa, a coffee table, and an old TV on a dresser, rugs with national ornaments on the walls and floor. Women with smiles handed her a set of bed linens, a large blanket, terry towels, and house slippers. Brand new. Emily somehow immediately warmed in that welcoming warmth. After a couple minutes, she caught up. "Please, let's get my supplies from the trunk. Not as payment for your help, not for your wonderful hospitality, just for fun. In them and every potato, cucumber, tomato, a part of my soul. I really want you to feel it." Having consulted among themselves, the residents of the apartment sent a whole delegation to the car, while the cab driver hurriedly snacked on something in the kitchen. An hour later, when her savior, who had been driving all day to feed his family, had long since disappeared in the blizzard, Emily was called into the kitchen. She went in and marveled. There were so many people at the big long table that her eyes were scattered. She thought, what a friendly people. They can't all be members of the same family. At the head of the table sat an elderly woman. Further along the perimeter, younger people. Many children. The men in this tribe from Central Asia were almost all still at work. Their bread in a foreign land was certainly not easy. Emily realized that local traditions and long-established household rituals were familiar from childhood. How difficult it was for these people from distant lands to accept the rules imposed on them and survive in an unfamiliar reality. A leisurely dinner began. The hearty meal was crowned by a large cast iron with a scattering of pilaf, which everyone at the table, as soon as they got a plate in their hands, neatly and skillfully ate directly with their hands. Next to the pilaf was a pile of boiled potatoes sprinkled with coarse salt, which for some reason did not dissolve in the moist steam. Everywhere around the edges were containers of Emily's pickles. One of the young women picked up a green cucumber and took a bite. The other women followed her example, and soon they were clucking approvingly, giving the master a thumbs up in approval. What a strange day it is, Emily thought after dinner. It's only 9 p.m. and already my eyes are traitorously slipping. Not a single person at the table asked her a single question, as if she'd been living with them for 1,000 years. The nearest neighbor then showed her where the bathroom was and escorted her to her temporary abode. Amazing, the woman stated. I don't remember Archie at all. The thread that ties us together, like the umbilical cord between a newborn baby and its mommy, has been severed. The hurt and all the memories associated with him seem to have fallen into the abyss of timelessness. Emily's mind was nothing but a viscous porridge that had had too much water poured into it when boiling. She fell asleep with her head barely touching the pillow. Earlier they had arranged with the cab driver, who had become her good wizard for the evening, that by 6 a.m. he would take her to the bus station for the first bus toward their village. It would be a full 4 hours on the highway to get home. Then, if she was lucky, a hitchhiker. Another half an hour on a dirt road to their village. The district administration promises that the road to their village will be asphalted. But they have been waiting 3 years for the promise. They have been living without a normal road for 30 years. That was the last thing Emily had time to think about before falling into a restful sleep. In the morning, the woman got up so cheerful that she surprised herself. Not a drop of despair after her son's treacherous stab in the back yesterday. Her soul was at peace. Yes, it was all on the doorstep of Archie's apartment. But it was as if the emotion had vanished. No grief, no sadness, no longing. A large cup of coffee and a fresh scone with cheese were waiting for her in the kitchen. One of the older women was carefully placing the same scones in a paper bag for her, gesturing that it was for the road. In her other hand, she held a clear plastic bag containing her jacket, shoved it embarrassedly into Emily's hands, and disappeared behind one of the doors. The cab driver from yesterday came up. Well, Mother? Did you have some fun with my relatives? No. They don't speak Russian very well yet. It was my mother who taught Russian at school in the town of Kant in Uzbekistan. That's why I'm so quick to communicate. She died of a serious illness when she was very young. Since then, I want to help every woman who is old enough to be my mother in some way. I won't hurt the young ones either. Why should I? But I try to be especially attentive to the older ones. I didn't have time to give them everything I didn't give my mother. I missed it. Your son will regret what he did. Yesterday 100 times over. He and I are about the same age, but he hasn't matured into true manly wisdom. They'll come crawling back to you on their knees. You'll remember my words later, but now let's hurry or we'll miss your bus. After the blizzard of yesterday, the city was frozen in snow-white silence. There was hardly a soul on the streets. Only lonely passers-by were hurrying somewhere to go about their business. At such an early hour, it was not even dawn. The sky only turned a pink haze. After gathering her things, nothing else was weighing on her hands. Home to Mama Ellen's house. She missed their home and her mother's caressing hands terribly. Walking lightly to the bus with 2 small bags was almost a pleasure. Emily bought a ticket for the first row of seats and climbed into the bus, which was already under steam and waiting for passengers to see her off. The cab driver waved goodbye once more, and she was suddenly so eager to remember her first and only love that she barely waited until everyone else had taken their seats. No one had bought a ticket next to her. She cozied up in 2 seats at once and plunged into the memories of 30 years ago. The love story of each couple is different. One has fatal passions simmering. The other has a craving for romance off the charts. The third duo builds relationships, as in the tragedies of Shakespeare. If you try to characterize the love of Emily and Vincent in one word, then the most suitable definition is pure mutual love at first sight. He'd noticed her. the girl staring helplessly at the piece of glass sticking out of her hand. She heaved with happiness the moment there was a cracking sound as he tore his cotton shirt into bandages. Their worlds were different. He came from a family of hereditary medical intellectuals. She is the daughter of Matthew and Ellen, born and raised in poverty by the Russian soil and post-war collective farms. Their points of contact were few. But does love ask whose hands to weave together? After the day, Vince and Emily had spent all day setting tables side by side in the cafeteria for the students, and then laughing their asses off watching a comedy at the club. They were hardly different. Here's the revised text. It was as if they were glued to each other with glue. While Emily flew into the dining room with a tray in anticipation of her evening date, Vince carefully stacked the watermelons and melons in the truck, then hurried off, never lingering anywhere. People were running toward him. In their endless conversations, they sometimes got lost and misunderstood each other. Emily would tell how her parents ran to the farm at night. The calf could not come into the world, completely tortured the mother cow, and Vince would ask with a frothing at the mouth whether she had read The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. Vince's family has only had this great novel, printed in a limited edition in 1973, for 3 days. So he and his parents didn't eat or sleep for 3 days in order to have time to read the literary masterpiece. What Pontius Pilate? Who is Wooland? Who are the Master and Margarita? Emily thought fearfully. I am so far from all this new stuff. Gently he took the girl by the hand and led her away to a club for dancing, a movie, or just wandering around the neighborhood. Not a hint of intimacy, just endless admiration. A hive that could not be played. Time inexorably flew forward. The days flashed by. Soon the students had to leave for the city. Emily and Vince were oblivious to their surroundings, lost in the marvelous gift of heaven, their first true love. Neither of them had any previous experience with the opposite sex. Vince, contrary to his parents' dreams, was not going to follow the path of a doctor, but was delirious with formulas, integrals and derivatives, the mysteries of theoretical mathematics. That's why he entered a technical university, not a medical school after school. He was not fond of girls, neither at school nor on the student bench. Once at the age of 15, he seemed to fall in love with a girl next to him, but tricksy, quiet, intelligent classmate Attention did not complain. He wrote all the notes in class to the loser. She made eyes at him, waited faithfully for her idol after class on the sports field behind the school building. Vince's feelings waned. He's back to his sine qua non. Emily had more of his love lyrics in her life. Her faithful knight, henchman, admirer Greg had kept her busy since 5th grade. He pulled her thick braid mercilessly, demanded that she write her homework regularly. In the 8th grade, tried to kiss at the New Year's Eve party, but Amy guessed his intentions, prudently washed away from the school ball. As soon as Greg went outside to smoke with the boys, she was gone. Now Vince and Emily were lucky that the girl's boyfriend wasn't in the village. He had gone to the sea with his parents for 2 months. His mother, on occasion a cook, in the pioneer camp from the regional factory, got a job for the hot season. His father, mentor in the circle of skillful hands. There, too, got a job. But they had been on some kind of shift positions before. No one in the village was surprised by their absence this time. Emily's parents noticed that her daughter does not walk, but flies above the ground, but did not interfere in her personal life. The mother only told her daughter, be careful. These good city boys are of a different mold, not like our country boys, who have what's on their minds, what's in their actions. Don't be afraid for me, Mommy. He's the best. He won't even lay a finger on me. We talk more and more. Yeah, we look at the stars at night. Naive thoughts. Who could beat Mother Nature and instincts? The last night before Vince left for home, he'd been so desperate to keep his hand in hers, so affectionate in Amy's eyes, that she couldn't understand what had come over her, what sweet eclipse had pushed her to do it. She rose up on her tiptoes and nestled her soft lips against Vince's, still smelling of the watermelon they'd just eaten together. The guy staggered back, wrapped his arms around the girl's shoulders, nuzzled his nose into the top of her head. Fire me. Don't provoke me. I haven't touched you on purpose all this time, love. I'm afraid if I touch you, I won't be able to stop. And I have to leave tomorrow. Who knows what lies ahead? And without stopping, Amy whispered into his ear. It's my decision. I trust you completely. Vince hadn't expected such boldness. In his 19 years, he hadn't yet known women. but he'd curiously perused the theory in his parents' manuals a long time ago. There was not an ounce of awkwardness, fear of seeming like an inexperienced novice. Of course, he had long dreamed of intimacy with Amy, but he was afraid of offending her, and, in order not to lose his temper, deliberately did not even go to kisses, longer than on the cheek to say goodbye too dear to her, too careful of her honor, too respectful. There is such a reverent attitude to the object of his worship. Not all young men devise strategies and tactics to get their girlfriend into bed as quickly as possible. Back home, Vince intended to announce to his parents that he'd met the love of his life. This year he would travel to the village to visit Amy. Then she'd go to college and move closer to him in the city. When the time comes, they'll get married. The girl was too young to break her destiny. Love had decided everything for both of them. They couldn't resist, they couldn't delay. Amy had no regrets. Vince was over the moon. Later at night, after their shy, naive lovemaking, right in the field, amidst the flower buds swarming approvingly on a soft carpet of lush green grasses, they lay hugging each other for a long time, dreaming of the future. They would certainly have a family, certainly 3 children. They would have their own cozy nest somewhere in the city. And in the summer they would come to her parents in the village to be once again in the place where they were connected by this dark blue night, with twinkling distant stars. In the morning, a service bus came to pick up the students. They parted easily, with the firm assurance that the next weekend Vince would come to visit his beloved. Vince never arrived. He was gone. Amy hadn't realized that his parents were at home with suitcases, sharing the news. Son, we're so excited. Dad was appointed director of a huge surgery center in the Far East. It's a modern complex. All the equipment there is state-of-the-art. The best specialists from all over the country are gathered under its roof. It's a great privilege to work there. We've already learned everything. There's also a state university nearby with the same mechanical and mathematical faculty as yours. We're flying out the day after tomorrow. Vince turned pale. What are we going to do? We made a deal with Amy. Daily correspondence by mail for now. I left her my address and hers. I promised to write to her on demand. She'll freak out if I suddenly disappear. After dinner, Vince told his mother that he had met an extraordinary girl in the village, that he was in love with her, and that he missed her. The only thing he'd withheld was the fact that he and Amy were close. Having listened to the attuned offspring, the wise woman immediately solved his problem. Went to a neighbor in the stairwell, with whom she was very friendly, and agreed that all correspondence coming to their address, she will immediately send them to the Far East. When she returned, she told her son about the way out of the situation. I thought to myself, I will later return to this issue. If I realize that our boy is really seriously attracted to that stranger. Otherwise he will have new friends, fellow students, new interests, and new girls. Life itself will put everything in its place. All that happened in Vince's family more than 30 years ago, Amy, of course, did not know. She herself, before she could even see the boy off on the bus, had rushed straight home to try out her pen in epistolary style. Yesterday's schoolgirl was not very good at it. She was afraid to write something stupid, so she decided that she would tell her lover on paper how her every day was going. The first pancake is always a pancake. Amy found it very difficult to write a few lines. By the time she delivered it to the post office a day later in a brightly colored envelope with hearts on it, Vince and his parents were boarding a plane at the airport. 10 hours into the flight, the airliner landed at the airport. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky was almost a stone's throw away. They would find themselves on the Pacific coast, in Ivaka Bay, which prepared for them a picturesque land. Vince. The parents are a young man himself. Amy, Matthew, and Ellen could not even think that a gray cardinal would interfere in the fate of 2 hearts in love. Vince's neighbor from the family across the hall. The reason is mundane. But it is this small trifle managed to forever turn the fate of the 2 families, putting their lives on a completely different track. The fact is that the neighbor had a very young daughter who had long been in love with Vince. She had already tortured her mother with dreams that when she grew up, she would become Vince's fiancée, his wife. Her mother, who herself had raised the now 13-year-old girl without a father, looked at the family of successful doctors with a distant eye toward a future in breeding. It's nothing that they have now gone to Kamchatka for a long ruble. They left the apartment in her care. They didn't even rent it to anyone. She's been trying for years to placate, to please, to inspire trust, to bake a couple of hearty cabbage pies. One for the neighbor, the doctor's ears. That, with their eternal operations, duty when his family night masterpieces to pamper. Boil strawberry jam half of the jars again to the neighbor dear. She has a whole strawberry bushes on the dacha. Well, it is not difficult for her to share with nice people. So, offerings, good-naturedness, questions and participation and tamed the family of surgeons. She had no time to look into their souls. When she took out the first letter from Amy with bright red hearts on the envelope, she didn't send it anywhere. She hid it in a candy box. Let it wait for its time. The rest of the masterpieces in epistolary style from the girl in love also went there. For the first time, she dared to open a message when the hearts on it were black. Who had failed to do so? It had been 3 months since the neighbors had left for distant lands. Vince's mother pelted the neighbor with questions over the phone. Has anything come for your son? The wily woman held her ground. Anything that came in your name. I dutifully sent to you. Immediately nothing else appeared in your mailbox. Presently she held above the steam this last grim, as she called it to herself, envelope. The letter stirred. It contained only a couple of lines. Vince, I can't keep quiet any longer. I'm pregnant. I'm still keeping it from my parents. But if you don't answer my cry for help, I'm going to go tell them my problem. The mother of a teenage daughter in love, pining for Vince, could not help but destroy such a letter in favor of the love of the young man and his mysterious village girlfriend. Knowing the intelligence of this all-medical family, she had no doubt they would not abandon the girl who had gotten their son pregnant to her fate. Not one, even the smallest, remorse did not arise in the soul of the loving mother when she set the ill-fated letter on fire over the flame of the gas stove in the kitchen. It's all right that the paper burned her fingers a little. No wedding, Vince. With another special way bred and grief herself, and the consequences of her promiscuity. Ellen did not regard the fact of the love child's coming into the world as a nuisance or grief. She was still insanely credulous, ecstatically waiting for any word from Vince. She justified his silence in every way she could, invented 1,000 explanations for why her beloved had not yet responded to her letters. When there was no point in hiding her situation from her parents, Ellen told Matthew and Ellen the truth, that she had no regrets, that she loved Vince more than her life, that she had wanted them to be close. There was no scolding, no anger, no bewilderment on the part of her elders. Mama Ellen put her small but strong arms around her. She looked into her eyes and read something in them that she alone knew. Then she said, as she stamped each word, if your city beau has evaporated forever, it's here without him. Evil tongues in the village do not listen. Big, true love is not given to everyone by fate. People will envy your happiness, and a child from the one you love, isn't that happiness? Remember. My dear, if the heavens gave you a child after your close encounter, it means that your deed was approved by the Lord God himself. Look at the world with joyful eyes, give birth, and grandmother and I will always be there for you. The news that Helen would soon become a young mother could not be kept secret in the village for long. Greg, who had returned from the seas, was furious. He even tried to scandalize Ellen. Caught her in the street, so that's what girl did not give a horn. I turn away from the gate. And with the other had time to tumble. The impregnable fortress fell quickly. Or have you always been such a girl? And me just for fun? Ellen tried to walk past the guy throwing angry accusations, but he suddenly rushed to her and frantically began to beg, you don't listen to me. My jealousy has taken root. If it happens that your sweetheart doesn't come back to you, I'll marry you and we'll raise your baby together. Yugi was surprised by such a statement from her longtime admirer. Knowing his tough temper, she didn't believe a word he said. Vince alone held her feminine heart. Looking at Greg, the expression shameful became clear. Her heart grew cold at the sight of Greg. It became icy cold. She wanted to run away at once. She didn't tell the boy about the frost inside her. She thanked him dryly for his offer to be together. Resolutely replied that it was impossible. That dialogue somehow became the last straw in her agonizing wait for Vince. It's a sad story of life's twists and turns and the mistakes of youth. When Yuji came home, a letter flew into town without any hearts on the envelope. Hello, Vince. Today I've decided to marry someone else. You are far away. He is always there. I don't see a future with you anymore. Goodbye, our love. I was probably just dreaming. Greg is reliable and faithful to me, which is something I value pricelessly in him. It wasn't Yugi's hand that was stroking the piece of paper. It was resentment, bitterness, and disappointment that whispered in her ear that she should write something derogatory, contemptuous, and cruel to her lover in retaliation. But Yugi still wouldn't sling mud, retaliate, reprimand. There's such an expression, not fate. She thought it was just such a case. The ubiquitous neighbor, who was assigned to send the mail, could not believe her luck. Thoughts fluttered around in her head like birds. The girl's heart couldn't take it. She still turned on the back, gave up Vince. And that's all me and my daughter want. This letter of hers I will send to the Far East with great pleasure. But her devious plans were not destined to come true. It is not for nothing that people talk about boomerangs. It caught up with her after that despicable act. In love with Vince, young lady in graduate school sharply changed priorities, fell into a bad company, fond of medicines. The mother of a classmate worked in a pharmacy. The boy, left there alone, began to understand the pills. And here the fashion went, and without a prescription they could get them. Alas, the mistakes of youth turned into a great tragedy for all participants in this story. What a pity that misunderstanding and intrigue separated two loving people. Their happiness was so close. Young people did not miss this opportunity. Once, betting on weakness, as I and the whole company decided to try a novelty. The guys drank the medicine in handfuls. Couldn't get the neighbor's daughter out of there. After the funeral, no consolation. The mother didn't last long. Why live if the only beloved blood daughter went to heaven prematurely, she thought. God was even more cruel to her, did not give her a quick demise, deprived her of reason. Only her nephew, the seventh water on the vine, remained among her relatives. Is he going to take care of an abnormal aunt, having registered guardianship over her? Quickly dumped a woman aged from grief in a specialized clinic, and rented the apartment to temporary tenants until then. Disassembling things in the house before the arrival of tenants, all the paraphernalia like old cardboard boxes and other unnecessary junk, he took to the trash cans. That's where the candy box with Vince's letters to Emily went too. Now there's no trace of their once great love. The last evidence of the story had faded into oblivion. In early June, as it was due, Emily had a son. The family named the boy Archie. A sturdy, healthy, smiling, actively growing son, and gave cheek. Grandfather Matthew and grandmother Helen on the price of the soul did not tea. Mama Emily idolized the boy, and each of his features found a resemblance to his favorite. Childhood like all the kids in the village fields and meadows with variety, vegetables and fruits in the garden and in the vegetable garden. Favorite river with cool water. The animal world in all yards with cows, bird kingdom, frisky cats. Everyone tried not to even hint about Vince's daddy, realizing that his daughter's heart was still aching, and still washed at night with secret tears of her first love. Vince was welcomed at the University of Texas with open arms. His transcript was full of excellent grades. His knowledge was at a high level. Very soon he was able to dive back into his favorite formulas. At first he waited for letters from Emily with such greed and impatience that his father and mother even feared a little for his mental health. Then there was a period of supposed calm. Vince didn't ask about news from his hometown, and his parents avoided the subject. The letter was a verdict on the village affair, and Vince took it a little strangely. It was as if he'd been expecting something like this, ready for it. He didn't want to share the heartbreak with his parents. The energy was boiling, the frustration inside. He evaluated the events himself, but he didn't voice it. However, youth, new discoveries, new places, new acquaintances took their toll. Gradually it began to seem to him that he had made it all up. A field with soft grass, the scents of flowers, the greedy lips of his beloved, the sparkle in her eyes. Maybe everyone's first experience leaves such vivid emotions. And in reality, everything was not so romantic. Somewhere in his heart there were echoes of memories, and then they faded into a dreamlike haze, like a fairy tale set against the backdrop of the countryside. Vince had given himself fully to science and had excelled in it. Even before he graduated, a prestigious foreign magazine published a small monograph on the application of certain mathematical formulas to industry. The graduate student mastered the English language perfectly unthinkable for the mid-90s in Russia. The young mathematician was seriously interested in Great Britain, and the USA. A year after defending his diploma, Vincent was offered a long internship at an American university. After consulting with his parents, he agreed. On the personal front, the technician-mathematician, who showed great promise, was not at all a reclusive monk. He had affairs with fellow students, did not ignore sparkling parties, easily made unburdensome connections with women. His heart was silent, and sometimes he couldn't even remember their names. Vince traveled to the United States alone, and there he suddenly fell in love. His romance with Maggie, a bright brunette wife from Florida who studied psychology at the same university where he was assigned to lecture, was like a tsunami, a typhoon, a love whirlwind, a tornado. When Vince was offered a contract for another 5 years, he accepted enthusiastically. Maggie finished her studies and finally moved in with him on campus, where he was assigned an office cottage with a large emerald lawn at the entrance and a swimming pool in the backyard. Maggie had only one major disadvantage for health reasons: she couldn't have children. That had bothered Vince at first, but then he'd come to terms with it. He loved the woman with a strange, morbid affection. After the modest wedding, little had changed in their union. Vincent still worked night and day on his mathematics. His wife chose to become a housewife. After his successful university work and marriage, Vince became a resident of this Western country. He had not been to Russia for many years. Modern gadgets now allowed him to communicate with the sight of his relatives on a large computer screen. His restless parents wouldn't part with medicine for an hour, even to visit him and his daughter-in-law. Vince and Maggie traveled extensively on the rare days they were free from work. His royalties were getting larger and larger on the basis of the unusual developments he had made. There was already much being implemented in industrial sectors and even in the space field. The essence of his work was so complex that only specialists understood it, and Vince couldn't stop working on new problems. If he had been asked what his life in America was like, he would have said, without hesitation, that it was happy and serene. It seemed that this prosperous era would be endless. But to whom does fate allocate only white joyful stripes? The black ink of sorrow spilled onto the whiteness. After 17 years of happy married life, Maggie unexpectedly fell in love with a young scientist-physicist who arrived, as her husband once arrived in the United States from Latin America for training. The man was unusually good-looking, a fiery mixture of southern blood, penetrating eyes, inquisitive gaze, luxurious curly hair. There was something of blue-blooded aristocrat and macho in his appearance at the same time. He wore his clothes with such elegance on his athletic figure that one could guess the graceful movements of a strong leopard. The female students in his lectures heard nothing of what he was trying to teach them, but only watched him like a hypnotist and a boa constrictor. Jinnah and the newly arrived scientist first crossed paths at a Thanksgiving party. November was chilly that year. The woman, all the while wrapped in a fashionable fur jacket over her evening gown, was saving herself with another shot of whiskey to keep warm. She picked up the glass with the hot drink and reached for the tongs to add ice to the drink. It was at that moment that she encountered the burning eyes of a dark-haired man with striking good looks. They say love is chemistry. The molecules of two bodies and souls collide in the air. Some catalyst intervenes and it's done. That's what happened for Maggie and her new object of attention. They left the party together. The woman didn't care what her husband thought about it. Maggie did not hide the protracted love affair, which became a rope between the two hearts, from Vincent. "I don't care what happens tomorrow, darling. Today I'm madly in love and also madly happy. You don't deserve deception on my part, so I'm saying all of this to your face. Accept it and forgive me. It just happened," she said succinctly. Vince listened to his wife calmly. He had already guessed what was going on and was unsurprised by his reaction. The painful agony of the beginning of their relationship was gone. By and large, he did not care where and with whom his wife spends time. Their love had exhausted itself. Even the warmth was almost gone, just a tribute to the years they had spent together. Nothing more. He suddenly had a sudden urge to leave everything in this distant country, which had never really become his native country, and return to Russia to his parents. But the laws did not allow him to disappear overnight after his divorce from his wife. He was still bound by certain obligations with the university. Some scientific developments continued, and lectures went on as usual. It was necessary to solve issues with real estate and other property, earned over years of hard work as a specialist of his level. The government and the company he worked for paid generously. Vince had amassed a considerable amount of capital that could help him start from scratch back home. It took him 2 seemingly endless years to resolve all the legal issues. Of course, during his stay there, he went to Russia several times to see his parents in person, but he never traveled further than the Far East. Now he wanted to travel to the places of his childhood, youth, and student years. The plans were grandiose. And then there was a meeting with his classmates in his hometown. He really wanted to take an active part in it. Archie's New Year's Eve romance, which had almost been ruined by his mother's sudden arrival with suitcases, had been a stormy and memorable one. Mandy was amazing. She had only one drawback: she was constantly, like a powerful vacuum cleaner, pulling out all of Archie's earnings. After a couple of months, it became clear that not only salaries and advances, but also rainy day reserves were flying into the wind. And Mandy kept saying, "Kitty, you're so cool. Buy me that purse that drove me crazy at the mall." Her mistress didn't want to do any of the housework. They ordered food from restaurants all the time. Cleaning the apartment once a week had to be done by a cleaning company. Inside, Archie began to grow a deafening irritation. But it was not so easy to get rid of the mistress who loved broad gestures. By the May holidays, she broke the news to him that she was pregnant. She talked about a stamp in the passport, a fashionable wedding dress from the latest collection, and necessarily diamonds and small ears, so that all her friends collapsed from envy. Marriage wasn't exactly in Archie's plans. He was visibly successful. At this time, his companion was sitting with her friends at the bar and sharing her plans for the near future. "Girls, another sucker has fallen for my bait. I have already told him the fairy tale that we will have a child. Now he's looking for a way out, and I have the next trump card up my sleeve. I'll tell him I'm ready to get rid of the baby. How would he know that after the first abortion I probably won't have children? And I'm a child-free person myself. I don't need cute babies screaming in diapers." "Aren't you afraid that one of your men will figure out your pregnancy adventure?" one of her friends asked, stirring her cocktail with a bright red plastic straw. "What are you talking about?" the experienced schemer grinned. "Most modern men are so afraid of the legal marriage stamp in their passports that they rush to count the payoffs for their freedom." Archie, meanwhile, was running through his head a combination of how to pull off a deal on behalf of his company and get a big kickback for services from the suppliers. He had no experience with commercial subterfuge. But that was okay, he could handle it. The main thing is that the preparation of this contract was entrusted to him. There was one thing the man hadn't considered. His boss was a clever businessman. He noticed the greedy gleam in his subordinate's eyes when talking about a new equipment purchase. So he instructed the security service to follow Archie in all his movements. A week later on his desk was a full report on the unbridled appetites of Mandy, who also worked in the same firm. Experienced servicemen through her friends also got to know about the scam she had planned. They even knew that Archie had already accepted the terms of separation from his mistress. Even crossed himself mentally, Lord, let him go to all 4 sides. What marriage? What children? From all this only unnecessary troubles appear. The company decided to catch Archie red-handed at the moment of his meeting with the machine manufacturers. So the 2 sides hit it off. The reward envelope is already in Archie's hands. It's time for a different scenario. Considering that this was the first attempt of the employee to pocket the fee for the deal in order to purchase not the best quality equipment, the chief fired Archie without severance pay. A rumor was immediately started following the man: "Unreliable specialists are not recommended to hire him." All of Emily's aspirations and endeavors went down the social garbage chute. How many lessons she once gave her boy, how many times before entering the technical university she took him to tutors in the city so that he could pass exams with high scores and enter the budget. The unified state exams were then introduced in the region as a trial experiment. Neither teachers nor students knew yet how this system would work. But he and Archie succeeded. How much later, in her student years, she fed, drank, clothed him? Would a young man be able to live on a paltry scholarship with his already then considerable demands? And it was their habit all summer to prepare supplies for the winter, to then solemnly hand the tasty gifts to their son. It had been 6 months now, and Emily still couldn't understand what had made Archie kick her out of the house in a blizzard. But she didn't want to find out what he was up to. She and her mother were still screwing jars of pickles and jam together this summer under long conversations, and they were still so fond of each other. They had no idea that Archie, long since separated from Maggie, was now living on casual labor. He was addicted to cheap hard liquor brought from unknown sources to the convenience store around the corner. His mother was unaware that now he would consider it a blessing to boil those homemade potatoes and snack on vodka with his mother's crunchy cucumber. Sometimes he had the impulse to go to the village and apologize, but his pride was not all drowned in the swamp of degrees. Here he will find a permanent job, he will rub everyone's nose in it, and then he will appear as a queen in his small homeland. The 30th anniversary of his graduation had been a very heartwarming occasion. Vincent didn't expect his classmates to follow his academic progress and be proud of him. The city of his childhood and youth had welcomed him very warmly in general. It hadn't changed much. Everything was native and familiar. After hearing about the tragic events in the family of his former neighbors in the stairwell, Vincent thought, I wish I knew how my life would have turned out if my father had not been assigned to that new surgical center in the Far East. Some annoying worm in his soul began to nudge him go to that village where you met your first love. No one is obliging you to anything, but don't you yourself want to put an end to that long-ago story? Hiring an automobile, still a novelty in this region, he set off. This western manner had always been to his liking. He vaguely remembered the name of the village where he had once harvested watermelons and melons in the melons fields, but that didn't bother him at all. He remembered the approximate route. He got there quickly on the highway, but when he turned onto a dirt road, he grinned to himself. Some things haven't changed a bit in more than 30 years. He was caught up by a UA's truck running on all sides, and Vincent, who had just stopped for a snack before it got dark, raised his hand to ask the driver to stop. Good people, good evening, he greeted the middle-aged man. Can you tell me how far it is to the village? I haven't been in your neighborhood for very many years. The owner of the Uazik looked around the foreigner curiously, at his appearance a gentleman in an expensive jacket and new jeans. Are you going to visit someone? Or so, driving around the neighborhood for idle curiosity, he asked. I'm looking for some people I know, Uncle Matthew and Aunt Ellen's family. They had a daughter, Emily, Vincent answered honestly, deciding not to be sarcastic. They do, the man nodded. Only the head of the family has been dead for about 7 years. The rest of them are alive and well. Vincent's breath caught in the excitement, and he could barely move his tongue. Emily and her husband are separated, aren't they? Family, kids. Emily has a son, the man replied. After hearing about the tragic events in the family of his former stairwell neighbors, Vincent thought, I wonder how my life would have turned out if my father hadn't been assigned to that new surgical center in the Far East. Some annoying worm in his soul began to nudge him go to that village where you met your first love. No one is obliging you to anything. But don't you yourself want to put an end to that long-ago story? Hiring an automobile. Still a novelty in this region, he set off. This western manner had always been to his liking. He vaguely remembered the name of the village where he had once harvested watermelons and melons in the melon fields, but that didn't bother him at all. He remembered the approximate route. He got there quickly on the highway, but when he turned onto a dirt road, he grinned to himself. Some things haven't changed a bit in more than 30 years. He was caught up by a UA's truck running on all sides, and Vincent, who had just stopped for a snack before it got dark, raised his hand to ask the driver to stop. Good people, good evening, he greeted the middle-aged man. Can you tell me how far it is to the village? I haven't been in your neighborhood for very many years. The owner of the Uazik looked around the foreigner curiously, at his appearance a gentleman in an expensive jacket and new jeans. Are you going to visit someone? Or so, driving around the neighborhood for idle curiosity, he asked. I'm looking for some people I know, Uncle Matthew and Aunt Ellen's family. They had a daughter, Emily, Vincent answered honestly, deciding not to be sarcastic. They do, the man nodded. Only the head of the family has been dead for about 7 years. The others are alive and well. There's a big brat. I even took her to him to town last winter on New Year's Eve. She's never been married. She gave birth to a boy 30 years ago to a student, but he left her when she was pregnant. She's been alone ever since. I asked to see her, but she refused. But I'm a little more than that with you, Yuji, said the man. Greg looked suspiciously at the colorful man, jumped into his UAZ and drove off across the field. Vince stood in the middle of the road in complete confusion. Then, just as quickly, he climbed into the car, unable to wait any longer. Now he would find his first love, his first woman, and what would be will be. In the village, he found the old cottage of Ellen's family. No hesitation. It's dark. Behind the pattern of this curtain, a bright light burned in the hut. The muffled sound of a television could be heard from the open window. He walked from the gate to the porch on trembling legs, climbed the 3 steps and knocked on the door. Behind it came brisk footsteps and a woman's whisper. "Emily, look who it is. You've come to see us at night." Emily threw a warm shawl around her shoulders. She had just bathed her mother and was dressing her in clean clothes. She had just bathed her mother and was dressing her in clean clothes as she dressed her. She looked at the guest silently from head to toe and said a phrase that made Vince's heart sink. "I knew you'd come back." Every love story may or may not have a sequel. Some endings are like a fairy tale, as happened in this marvelous novel. Listening to the story of Vince and Emily's love story, there's so much irony. You'd think some writer was feeding us fables. It doesn't happen in real life. But it did happen. Emily's wise woman's heart did not set up a judgment on the actions of the man she loved. Sensible masculine heart of Vincent immediately prioritized with mathematical precision, scattered the answers to the tasks at hand. Neither of them knew where the girl's letters had disappeared to. Some evil force had played out for them this sad play of long separation, where they had the lead roles. Archie, who had been working as a loader in a regular store for the 2nd year, decided to go to a beer bar after his shift to relax a little. Lately, he had stopped with stronger drinks, as he began to ruin his liver. Had enough sense to tone it down a bit. The man at the far table seemed vaguely familiar to him. Grabbing a mug with a still foamy cap and a plate of dried shrimp, he headed over to keep him company. Greg. It was him, having settled all his business, stopping at the first bar he could find to grab a bite to eat. He didn't recognize Archie as the unkempt, bearded man who plumped himself on the stool opposite him. "Isn't there any other tables around?" he asked his uninvited neighbor with hostility. "Don't you recognize me, Uncle Greg?" "It's me, Archie. We're from the same village." It was only now that Greg realized that the drunken man looked remotely like Emily's son, only lower and older, but still he was recognizable. "How's life with you?" "My grandmother's still alive and my mom's still working on her pickles." Archie tried to stretch his face into a wry smile, but his mood suddenly soured. Why did he even sit down with his fellow countrymen? It seemed that he had once been in love with his mother, and now he was going to start teaching him about life again. But Greg grinned good-naturedly and answered, "The whole village is praying for your mother. We have a new road with excellent asphalt. Her husband organized everything and paid the expenses. My grandmother was taken to the Far East, to a surgical center, and was treated a little. She hasn't become active, but she can move around quite well with a stick. And your parents have built such a nice house next to the old house. It's a sight to behold." Archie thought he'd misheard. Why did Uncle Greg say parents and not one mother? It was as if he'd overheard his thoughts. The countryman went on with his story. Archie's parents had a beautiful love story. 30 years later, they were reunited again. Everyone in the village used to think that such things only happened in books and movies. No, I witnessed for myself that a woman's love is strong, strong and faithful. She waited. This story warmed my soul, gave me hope that even at their age, happiness is still possible. "Come on, brother, I still have to get home. Shall I say hello to your mother? Or would you deign to show up at their house yourself?" "I'll take care of it," Archie grumbled. His mood had fallen, along with his ego. The bus pulled away from the bus stop near the village. The driver looked back at the passenger compartment. There was only some vague-looking man getting out, moving his lips all the way, as if he were practicing a speech. Archie was really working hard to find the words he would say to his mother to apologize. But everything that came into his head seemed empty and insignificant. Love for one's family is in actions, not words. Could he earn forgiveness from his parents? The man crept quietly to the ajar gate and peered through the opening. Workers were laboring in the yard near the old house. A picturesque log house of 2 stories stood out next to the construction site. It immediately reminded Archie of some fairy tale log cabin, where Santa Claus, forest gnomes, or some other magical characters could live. Everything around breathed coziness, some special domestic charm. His mother walked through the yard in an embrace with a gray-haired man. "Yes, it's going to be a great bath. Don't worry," Maggie the man said. "Ellen's mother will be back from her treatment soon. It'll be a nice surprise for her." He kissed the woman on the top of her head and hurried off to the workers to give them new orders. Emily returned to the gazebo, where the electric kettle was already boiling. A jar of Archie's favorite apricot jam and vases of cookies stood on the table. He pushed the wicket gently open and stepped forward, mentally vowing to himself that he would do everything he could to make his family forgive him and welcome him back into their home. If necessary, he would start his journey again from scratch, from the basics. He now knows exactly what things rule this world. Someday he will teach these truths to his children.